Welcome, Night Warden of Forgotten Souls, to the shadowed halls of Arkham Asylum, where Gotham's most tormented minds find their uneasy rest behind walls that have witnessed madness in all its terrible forms. Tonight, we shall walk these moonlit corridors together, opening the sealed files of those who have challenged the Dark Knight's resolve and tested the very limits of human sanity. Let the echo of distant footsteps and the whisper of turning pages carry you into peaceful slumber as we explore each tragic tale of brilliance, corrupted, innocence lost, and minds fractured by the weight of their own darkness. In the beginning, before the purple suit became a symbol of terror across Gotham's darkest nights, before the chalk-white skin and crimson smile became the face that haunted the dreams of children and the nightmares of adults, there existed a man whose name has been lost to the chemical fires that consumed his sanity, and whose identity remains as fluid and changeable as the madness that defines his every waking moment. This is the tale of Patient File 0001, the being who calls himself the Joker, though he has worn 1,000 faces and told 1,000,000 lies about his origins, each story as true and as false as the last. For in the realm of absolute chaos, even the past becomes negotiable. The most persistent legend surrounding the birth of the Clown Prince of Crime begins in the shadows of Ace Chemicals, where desperation and circumstance conspired to transform an ordinary man into something far more dangerous than any criminal Gotham had ever known. He was a comedian then, though his jokes fell flat and his audiences remained stubbornly silent. A failed entertainer whose dreams of bringing laughter to the world had curdled into bitter disappointment and mounting debt that threatened to crush what remained of his fragile hopes. The wife he loved carried within her womb the promise of new life, a child who might have given meaning to his struggles and purpose to his suffering. Yet fate had already begun weaving the threads that would unravel everything he held dear. The accident that claimed her life, that stole away both the woman who had believed in him when no one else would, and the unborn child who represented his future, created within him a wound so deep that it never truly healed, a void that would eventually be filled by something far darker than mere grief. It was this profound loss that made him vulnerable to the criminal elements, who approached him with offers that seemed to promise easy solutions to his financial difficulties, and perhaps, though he would never admit it to himself, a way to strike back at a universe that had taken everything meaningful from his existence. The Red Hood gang needed someone with intimate knowledge of Ace Chemicals, someone who could guide them through the facility's security systems and help them access the millions of dollars worth of equipment and materials housed within its heavily guarded walls. The red hood that gave the gang its name was passed among its members like a crown of thorns, each wearer knowing that he would serve as the primary target should their crimes be discovered, the expendable face behind which the true leaders could hide their identities and escape responsibility for their actions. When it came time for the chemical plant robbery, the desperate comedian found himself wearing that crimson symbol of doom, his face hidden behind its reflective surface as he led criminals through corridors where he had once hoped to find legitimate employment. The Batman who confronted them that night was still new to his war on crime, still learning the delicate balance between justice and vengeance that would define his lifelong crusade. Yet his presence in the chemical plant was enough to transform what should have been a simple robbery into a catastrophe that would reshape the criminal landscape of Gotham City forever. The pursuit that followed was brief but decisive, driving the Red Hood toward the very vats of bubbling chemicals that would soon claim far more than his appearance. The fall into those toxic pools was not merely physical but metaphysical, a descent that carried him beyond the boundaries of normal human experience into realms where pain and pleasure, tragedy and comedy, meaning and meaninglessness swirled together in combinations that no sane mind could process or accept. The chemicals that bleached his skin and stained his hair were merely the external manifestation of a transformation that occurred on levels far deeper than mere biology, a fundamental restructuring of consciousness itself. When he emerged from those acid baths, the man who had once told jokes that nobody laughed at had become a joke that nobody could escape, his appearance forever marking him as something other than human, while his mind shattered into fragments that reflected different aspects of madness with crystalline clarity. The white skin and green hair were badges of his transformation, visible symbols of the internal revolution that had overthrown every assumption he had ever held about the nature of reality and his place within it. The laughter that burst from his chemically altered lips was not the sound of joy, but of revelation, the terrible understanding that everything he had believed about meaning and purpose had been an elaborate cosmic joke, that the universe itself was nothing more than a vast comedy routine performed for an audience that did not exist. His smile became a permanent fixture, not because he was happy, but because he had finally understood that happiness and sadness were equally meaningless in a reality where chaos reigned supreme over order. The philosophy that emerged from his shattered psyche was as simple as it was terrifying. If life had no inherent meaning, then the only rational response was to embrace the absurdity completely, to become the punchline to existence's greatest joke, while forcing others to confront the same terrible truth that had driven him beyond the boundaries of sanity. He would be the agent of chaos in a world that desperately clung to illusions of order, the living proof that one bad day was all it took to reduce the most rational mind to gibbering madness. His crimes were not motivated by greed or personal ambition, but by a deeper desire to demonstrate the fundamental absurdity of human existence. Each elaborate scheme, designed to strip away the pretenses and civilized facades that allowed people to pretend their lives had meaning beyond the random accidents of birth and circumstance. The death traps and theatrical scenarios he created were parables of meaninglessness, object lessons in the futility of human striving, and the inevitable triumph of chaos over all attempts at order. The relationship between the Joker and Batman became the central obsession of his existence, for in the Dark Knight he found the perfect foil for his philosophy of chaos, a man who had experienced his own terrible loss yet had chosen to impose meaning upon meaninglessness through dedication to justice and order. Their eternal conflict was more than mere criminal versus crime fighter. It was a philosophical debate conducted through violence and terror, each encounter testing whether hope could triumph over despair, purpose over nihilism. In Batman, the Joker saw his own reflection inverted, another man who had been broken by tragedy, yet had responded in precisely the opposite way, choosing to become a symbol of hope rather than an agent of chaos. This made the Dark Knight the most important person in the Joker's twisted universe, the one individual whose existence gave meaning to his own crusade against meaning, whose continued resistance to madness made the Joker's philosophy incomplete and therefore intolerable. The various origin stories that the Joker told about himself were all simultaneously true and false, reflecting his understanding that in a chaotic universe, even the past was subject to revision and reinterpretation. Sometimes he claimed to be a failed comedian, other times a petty criminal, occasionally a brilliant scientist driven mad by his own discoveries. The inconsistency was not confusion, but clarity, the recognition that identity itself was just another joke that people told themselves to avoid confronting the terrifying possibility that they were nothing more than random collections of atoms temporarily arranged in patterns that would eventually dissolve back into chaos. The concept of supersanity that some psychologists applied to the Joker's condition suggested that his madness was actually a form of hyper-awareness, a consciousness so acute that it could perceive the underlying absurdity of existence that normal minds were designed to filter out and ignore. In this interpretation, his insanity was not a departure from reality, but a deeper engagement with it, a willingness to acknowledge truths that others found too terrible to contemplate. The therapeutic sessions conducted with the Joker at Arkham Asylum invariably ended in failure, not because his condition was untreatable, but because treatment itself presupposed the existence of a stable identity that could be healed and restored. The Joker's madness was not a disease that had infected a healthy mind, but a complete reconstruction of consciousness that had eliminated the very foundations upon which traditional psychology was built. His ability to manipulate and corrupt others stemmed from his intimate understanding of the psychological mechanisms that people use to maintain their illusions of meaning and purpose. By systematically destroying these defense mechanisms, he could reduce even the most stable personalities to the same state of chaotic awareness that defined his own existence, proving through demonstration that sanity was nothing more than a collective delusion that could be shattered by anyone with sufficient skill and determination. The Joker's relationship with death was as complex and contradictory as every other aspect of his existence, for while he seemed to court destruction with reckless abandon, he also possessed an almost supernatural ability to survive situations that should have killed him countless times over. This apparent immortality was not supernatural but psychological, reflecting his complete disconnection from the self-preservation instincts that governed normal behavior. The comedy routines that he performed during his crimes were parodies of the entertainment industry that had rejected him in his previous life, twisted versions of the jokes and performances that had once represented his dreams of bringing joy to others. Now his audience was captive rather than voluntary, his punchlines delivered through terror rather than timing, his laughter generated by fear rather than appreciation. The playing cards that served as his calling cards were symbols of randomness and chance, reminders that life itself was nothing more than a game where the rules were constantly changing, and the only winning move was to stop pretending that winning had any meaning at all. The Joker card that he favored represented his role as the wild card in reality's deck, the unpredictable element that could transform any situation from order to chaos with a single well-timed intervention. His various hideouts and headquarters reflected his fluid relationship with identity and purpose, ranging from abandoned comedy clubs that mocked his failed past to elaborate funhouses that turned childhood joy into adult terror. These spaces were extensions of his psyche made manifest, physical representations of a mind that had been transformed into a landscape where nightmares and dreams, past and present, meaning and meaninglessness coexisted without contradiction or resolution. The henchmen who served the Joker were as disposable to him as he was to reality itself, temporary arrangements of flesh and consciousness that would inevitably be dissolved and reconfigured according to the whims of chaos. Their loyalty was purchased not through payment or intimidation, but through the terrible gift of understanding, the revelation that their lives had no more meaning than his own, except as components in increasingly elaborate jokes that no one would ever find funny. The psychological impact of the Joker's existence extended far beyond his immediate victims to encompass all of Gotham City and everyone who lived within its borders, for his very presence in the world served as proof that chaos could triumph over order, that meaning could be stripped away as easily as sanity, that the thin veneer of civilization was constantly under threat from forces that recognized no law except the imperative to destroy everything that pretended to matter. The various attempts to execute or permanently contain the Joker met with failure not because of any supernatural protection, but because his existence served a necessary function in the psychological ecosystem of Gotham City. providing a focal point for fears and anxieties that might otherwise manifest in even more destructive forms. He was the shadow that gave definition to the light, the chaos that made order precious, the madness that validated sanity through contrast and opposition. In the deepest hours of the night, when even the guards at Arkham Asylum whispered among themselves about the patient in the maximum security wing, whose laughter could be heard echoing through the corridors long after lights out, the Joker sat in his cell and contemplated the magnificent joke that his existence represented. He had become the punchline to reality's greatest jest, the living proof that meaning was meaningless, and that the only appropriate response to existence was laughter that acknowledged its own emptiness. The files that documented his crimes filled entire rooms at police headquarters and psychiatric facilities throughout the country. Yet these records captured only the external manifestations of his chaotic philosophy rather than its deeper implications for human consciousness and the nature of reality itself. He was more than a criminal, more than a madman, more than a force of nature. He was a question mark carved into the face of certainty, a permanent reminder that chaos lurked beneath every attempt at order. The mirror that the Joker held up to Batman and to Gotham City itself reflected not just their fears, but their deepest truths. The recognition that they too were balanced on the razor's edge between sanity and madness, meaning and meaninglessness, hope and despair. In his terrible laughter, they heard the echo of their own potential for chaos, the understanding that they too were only one bad day away from joining him in the realm beyond reason and responsibility. And so the clown prince of crime continued his eternal performance, his makeup never quite covering the scars that marked his transformation, his smile never quite reaching eyes that had seen too much truth to ever find genuine joy again. He was Gotham's greatest nightmare and its most honest citizen, the one inhabitant of the city who had stripped away all pretenses and acknowledged what everyone else refused to admit, that in the end, we are all just waiting for the punchline to a joke that no one will ever understand. In the annals of Arkham Asylum's most tragic cases, few files carry the weight of shattered idealism and corrupted justice more heavily than Patient File 0034, the folder that bears the name Harvey Dent, alongside the haunting designation of Two-Face. This is the chronicle of a man who once stood as Gotham's greatest hope for legal redemption, a prosecutor whose passion for justice burned so brightly that it illuminated the darkest corners of the city's criminal underworld, yet whose fall from grace would prove that even the purest intentions could be twisted into instruments of chaos when filtered through a mind fractured by trauma and consumed by the terrible mathematics of chance. Before the scarred coin became his compass and binary thinking his religion, Harvey Dent embodied everything that Gotham City desperately needed in its war against corruption and moral decay. He was the White Knight who rode into battle against the forces of organized crime with nothing but law books as his armor and unwavering principle as his sword, believing with the fervor of a true believer that justice was not merely an ideal, but an achievable reality that could be imposed upon even the most corrupt society through proper application of legal precedent and moral courage. The young prosecutor, who earned the nickname Apollo for his golden reputation and seemingly incorruptible nature, possessed the rare combination of brilliant legal mind and genuine compassion for victims that made him uniquely qualified to take on the entrenched criminal organizations that had turned Gotham's legal system into their personal playground. His courtroom victories were not mere professional achievements but moral crusades that restored faith in the possibility that good could triumph over evil through legitimate channels rather than vigilante violence. The friendship between Harvey Dent and Bruce Wayne was built upon shared recognition that Gotham's salvation required coordinated efforts from both the legal system and private philanthropy. each man contributing his unique talents and resources to the common goal of creating a city where children could grow up without fear and families could prosper without corruption. Neither suspected that their parallel campaigns against crime would eventually converge in ways that would test the very foundations of their alliance and their individual commitments to justice. The romantic relationship between Harvey and Rachel Dawes added another layer of personal stakes to his professional crusade, for she represented not only his emotional anchor, but also his connection to the possibility of normal human happiness, beyond the all-consuming demands of his prosecutorial mission. Her presence in his life served as a reminder that victory over crime was meaningless unless it created space for love and family and all the ordinary joys that made existence worthwhile rather than merely endurable. The psychological profile that emerged from Harvey's early years revealed a mind that operated according to strict moral categories, dividing the world into clearly defined regions of right and wrong, legal and illegal, good and evil with the precision of a mathematician solving equations. This binary worldview served him well in the courtroom where legal precedents provided clear guidelines for determining guilt and innocence. Yet, it also created vulnerabilities that would later prove catastrophic when reality refused to conform to such neat categorizations. The criminal empire of Sal Maroni represented everything that Harvey Dent had dedicated his life to destroying, a vast network of corruption that extended its tentacles into every aspect of Gotham's political and economic life while maintaining the facade of legitimate business operations. The case against Maroni was more than just another prosecution. It was a direct assault on the power structures that had turned Gotham into a playground for criminals and a hell for honest citizens. The investigation that Harvey conducted with the assistance of Commissioner Gordon and the mysterious Batman revealed layers of corruption so extensive that they challenged even his considerable faith in the possibility of legal redemption. Evidence of judicial bribery, police misconduct, political manipulation, and witness intimidation painted a picture of a system so thoroughly compromised that conventional prosecution seemed almost hopelessly inadequate to the scope of the problem. Yet Harvey's commitment to working within the legal system remained unshaken, even as the obstacles multiplied and the dangers increased, for he believed with religious intensity that abandoning proper procedures in favor of expedient solutions would make him no better than the criminals he sought to bring to justice. The law was sacred to him, not merely as a professional tool, but as the foundation upon which civilized society must stand if it hoped to survive the constant assault of chaos and criminality. The trial of Sal Maroni became the focal point for all of Harvey's hopes and fears about the possibility of achieving justice through legitimate channels, a test case that would determine whether Gotham's legal system retained sufficient integrity to function as intended, or had become so corrupted that only extra-legal solutions could provide meaningful protection for innocent citizens. The stakes could not have been higher, for failure would represent not just a professional setback but the collapse of everything Harvey had built his identity around. The security arrangements for the trial were unprecedented in Gotham's legal history, reflecting the very real possibility that Maroni's organization would attempt to eliminate key witnesses, intimidate jury members, or even attack the courthouse itself rather than accept the risk of conviction and imprisonment. Harvey insisted on proceeding despite these threats, arguing that giving in to criminal intimidation would establish a precedent that would make future prosecutions impossible and effectively surrender the city to mob rule. The moment when Sal Maroni threw the acid that would forever alter Harvey Dent's life and mind was preceded by weeks of escalating tension and increasingly desperate attempts by the defense to derail the proceedings through procedural challenges and witness intimidation. The vial of corrosive chemicals had been smuggled past security through methods that revealed the depth of corruption within the system that Harvey had spent his career trying to purify and protect. The physical agony that Harvey experienced as the acid ate through the left side of his face was matched by psychological trauma that went far deeper than mere disfigurement, for the attack represented the complete failure of everything he had believed about the power of legal institutions to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The careful security arrangements had been bypassed, the legal proceedings had been corrupted, and the man who had dedicated his life to justice had been scarred and broken while the criminal responsible walked free. The medical treatment that followed the attack could repair some of the physical damage but could do nothing to heal the deeper wounds to Harvey's psyche, the fundamental crack in his worldview that had been created by the revelation that his faith in legal justice had been misplaced. The mirror that reflected his scarred features back to him also reflected the shattered remains of his idealistic belief that good would always triumph over evil if given sufficient time and proper legal support. The psychological transformation that began during Harvey's recovery was initially subtle, manifesting as increased cynicism about the legal system and growing sympathy for more direct methods of achieving justice that bypassed the corruption and inefficiency of traditional law enforcement. His colleagues attributed these changes to understandable bitterness about his disfigurement and the trauma of the attack, yet they represented something far more fundamental than temporary emotional adjustment to physical disability. The coin that would become Harvey's signature prop and decision-making tool emerged during his hospital stay as a seemingly innocent coping mechanism, a way of making small choices about treatment options and daily routines without having to engage his traumatized psyche in complex decision-making processes. The simple binary of heads or tails appealed to a mind that was struggling to process the collapse of its moral categories and needed desperately to find some form of order that could not be corrupted or subverted. The scarring of the coin through Harvey's own actions transformed it from a harmless psychological crutch into a symbol of his fundamental transformation, from idealistic prosecutor to fatalistic judge, its damaged surface reflecting his understanding that the universe itself was scarred and random rather than ordered and just. The decision to base all future choices on the flip of this corrupted currency represented his acceptance that chance, rather than justice, governed human affairs. The emergence of the two-faced persona was not a sudden psychological break, but a gradual splitting of Harvey's consciousness into complementary yet opposing aspects, each representing different responses to the trauma that had shattered his unified sense of identity and purpose. The scarred side embraced chaos and revenge, while the unmarked side retained vestigial attachment to order and law, creating an internal conflict that could only be resolved through external action. The first crimes committed by Two-Face were targeted specifically at the legal system that had failed to protect Harvey Dent, with judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court personnel all becoming potential victims based on their connection to cases that had been corrupted by criminal influence or bureaucratic incompetence. These were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations designed to demonstrate the fundamental injustice of a system that claimed to serve justice while actually serving only power and influence. The elaborate death traps and binary choices that became Two-Face's trademark reflected his psychological need to impose the same terrible choice between order and chaos on others that had been forced upon him by his scarring experience. The victims who faced these scenarios were required to confront the random nature of survival and the meaninglessness of conventional moral categories in situations where chance rather than virtue determined outcomes. The relationship between Two-Face and Batman became complicated by their shared history and Harvey's knowledge of the Dark Knight's methods and limitations, creating a dynamic where former allies found themselves on opposite sides of a philosophical divide about the nature of justice and the proper response to systemic corruption. Batman's attempts to reach the Harvey Dent persona within Two-Face were consistently undermined by the scarred side's growing dominance and its rejection of everything that Harvey had once believed. The duality obsession that defined Two-Face's criminal activities extended beyond simple binary choices to encompass elaborate schemes involving pairs of victims, doubled crimes, and scenarios where opposing outcomes were equally possible and equally meaningless. His hideouts were divided down the middle between order and chaos. His gang was organized around the principle of binary opposition, and his very identity was split between past and present, hope and despair, law and anarchy. The philosophical implications of Two-Face's transformation resonated throughout Gotham's legal community as prosecutors and judges were forced to confront their own vulnerability to the kind of systematic corruption and violence that had destroyed Harvey Dent's career and sanity. The White Knight's fall served as a cautionary tale about the limits of idealism in a world where criminals possessed resources and determination that often exceeded those of their legal opponents. The various attempts to rehabilitate Harvey Dent and restore his psychological unity met with limited success, hindered by the fundamental nature of his trauma and his acceptance of chance as the only honest organizing principle in a universe that had proven itself to be random and cruel. The coin flip had become more than a decision-making tool. It was a philosophical statement about the nature of reality and the futility of human attempts to impose meaning on meaningless events. The legal community's response to Harvey's transformation included enhanced security measures for high-profile trials and increased psychological support for prosecutors working on dangerous cases. Yet these reforms could not address the underlying corruption that had made Harvey's destruction possible. The system that had failed to protect its most dedicated servant remained fundamentally unchanged despite the tragic lesson of his fall. The friendship between Harvey and Bruce Wayne became one of the most painful casualties of the transformation, for Bruce found himself unable to save his friend from the psychological abyss that had opened beneath him, while also being forced to oppose him as Batman when Two-Face's actions threatened innocent lives. The personal stakes involved in their confrontations added layers of tragedy that went far beyond typical hero-villain dynamics. The coin that governed Two-Face's decisions became a source of both power and torment, providing him with a framework for action that required no moral reasoning or emotional investment, while also trapping him in patterns of behavior that prevented genuine choice or personal growth. He had become a slave to the very randomness that he claimed to embrace, his fate determined by forces no more meaningful than the flip of a scarred piece of metal. The legacy of Harvey Dent's transformation extended beyond his individual tragedy to encompass broader questions about the nature of justice and the psychological costs of fighting corruption in systems that were designed to protect the very criminals they claimed to oppose. His fall served as a reminder that even the most dedicated public servants were vulnerable to the forces they battled, and that victory over crime required not just legal expertise but psychological resilience that few individuals possessed. The case files that documented Two-Face's crimes revealed a mind that retained much of Harvey Dent's legal knowledge and tactical intelligence, while applying these capabilities toward goals that would have horrified his former self. The prosecutor, who had once built careers on protecting victims, had become a perpetrator who used his understanding of the legal system to evade, capture, and maximize the psychological impact of his attacks. The binary worldview that had served Harvey well as a prosecutor became a prison that trapped Two-Face in cycles of meaningless opposition and random violence, preventing him from achieving the very goals that had motivated his transformation. His attempts to expose corruption and punish injustice were undermined by methods that created more chaos than clarity, more suffering than resolution. In the quiet moments between his elaborate schemes and violent confrontations, the man who had once been Gotham's greatest hope for legal redemption sat in his divided lair and contemplated the terrible mathematics of his existence, the equation that had reduced all human choice to the simple binary of heads or tails, good or bad, life or death. The coin that determined his actions reflected his understanding that meaning was an illusion that could be shattered as easily as a face could be scarred, leaving behind only the random patterns of chance and the terrible freedom of accepting that nothing truly mattered except the next flip of fate's cruel currency. The mirror that showed Two-Face his divided reflection also revealed the divided nature of justice itself, the recognition that law and order were human constructs imposed upon a universe that recognized neither virtue nor villainy, only the endless cycle of action and consequence that played out according to rules, no more meaningful than the physics that govern the fall of a spinning coin through empty air toward an indifferent ground. In the shadowed corridors of Arkham Asylum, where broken minds seek solace behind walls that have witnessed every conceivable form of human madness, few patient files evoke such complex emotions as Patient File 0067, the record that bears witness to the tragic metamorphosis of Oswald Chesterfield Cobblepot. His story begins not in the criminal underworld that would eventually claim him as one of its most notorious princes, but in the gilded drawing rooms of Gotham's social elite, where a child's deformities became the seeds of a lifelong war against a society that had rejected him before he could even speak his first words. The mansion that housed the Cobblepot family during Oswald's formative years stood as a monument to old Gotham money and aristocratic pretension, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had built their fortunes through shipping, real estate, and the kind of morally flexible business practices that created dynasties while destroying competitors. Yet within these halls of inherited privilege, young Oswald learned his earliest and most bitter lessons about the cruel mathematics of social acceptance and the ways that physical appearance could determine one's entire trajectory through life. The genetic lottery that had blessed the Cobblepot lineage with wealth and social position had cursed Oswald with a collection of physical abnormalities that marked him as fundamentally different from the beautiful children who populated his family's social circle. His stunted stature, pronounced nose, and webbed fingers created a grotesque caricature that seemed designed by fate to mock the very concepts of aristocratic breeding and genetic superiority that formed the foundation of his family's identity. The nickname that would follow him throughout his life emerged from the cruel mouths of children who possessed the unique ability to identify and exploit weakness with surgical precision, transforming his waddling gait and awkward proportions into a source of endless amusement for those blessed with more conventional appearances. The Penguin became not merely a name, but an entire identity imposed upon him by a society that reduced complex human beings to their most obvious physical characteristics. The mother who should have provided refuge from the cruelties of the outside world instead became an additional source of shame and confusion, her overprotective obsession with his safety creating a suffocating environment that prevented normal social development, while her simultaneous embarrassment about his appearance sent contradictory messages about his worth and place in the claimant family hierarchy. The umbrella that she insisted he carry at all times became both shield against the elements and symbol of his fundamental isolation from normal human experience. The private tutors who educated Oswald in the academic subjects deemed appropriate for his social station could do nothing to address the deeper curriculum of humiliation and rejection that he absorbed through daily interactions with a Blentz world that seemed designed to remind him of his inadequacies. His intellectual gifts, which were considerable, became weapons that he learned to wield against those who had wounded him. Yet they also isolated him further from potential allies, who might have seen past his appearance to recognize his genuine capabilities. The birds that became his obsession during these lonely childhood years represented everything that he was not: graceful, beautiful, capable of flight that lifted them above the petty concerns and social hierarchies that trapped earthbound creatures in cycles of cruelty and competition. His study of ornithology became both escape from human society and preparation for the day when he would use his knowledge of these creatures to create an identity that transcended the limitations imposed by his physical form. The transformation from awkward child to criminal mastermind began during Oswald's adolescent years, when the combination of social rejection and intellectual development created a toxic brew of resentment and ambition that would define the remainder of his existence. The realization that conventional paths to success and acceptance were closed to him led to the exploration of alternative routes that operated outside the boundaries of legal and social convention. The criminal underworld that Oswald entered as a young man initially seemed to offer the kind of merit-based advancement that legitimate society had denied him, a realm where intelligence and ruthlessness mattered more than appearance or social connections. Yet even here he encountered the same prejudices and limitations that had defined his childhood, as criminals proved no more capable than socialites of looking past his grotesque exterior to recognize his genuine talents. The slow climb through Gotham's criminal hierarchy required Oswald to develop a persona that could command respect through fear when it could not earn affection through charm, transforming his physical abnormalities from sources of shame into instruments of intimidation. The Penguin became not merely a nickname but a brand that promised sophisticated violence and calculated revenge against all those who had underestimated him throughout his life. The umbrellas that became his signature weapons represented the perfect fusion of his aristocratic background and criminal present, transforming the symbol of his childhood protection into instruments of adult aggression. Each modified parasol contained hidden blades, poison gas dispensers, or firearms that could eliminate enemies while maintaining the facade of civilized behavior that separated him from common thugs and street criminals. The nightclub that served as his primary base of operations embodied his complex relationship with the society that had rejected him, creating a space where he could play the role of sophisticated host while simultaneously operating one of Gotham's most profitable criminal enterprises. The Iceberg Lounge became a theater where the awkward child could perform the part of the successful businessman, surrounded by beautiful people who feared him enough to pretend affection and loyalty. The criminal empire that Oswald constructed around his penguin persona reflected his understanding that power was the only currency that could purchase the respect and recognition that birth and breeding had failed to provide. His operations encompassed everything from traditional organized crime activities like gambling and protection rackets to more sophisticated schemes involving art theft, political corruption, and international smuggling that demonstrated his intellectual capabilities to those who might otherwise dismiss him as a freak. The relationship between the Penguin and Batman became one of mutual recognition between two individuals who had chosen to define themselves through symbols and personas that transcended their original identities. Yet their shared understanding of performance and reinvention could not bridge the fundamental moral gulf that separated their approaches to achieving their goals. Where Batman used fear as a tool for justice, the Penguin employed terror as an instrument of personal revenge and social advancement. The psychological profile that emerged from extended observation of the Penguin's behavior revealed a mind that retained all the wounded sensitivity of the rejected child while developing the calculating ruthlessness necessary for criminal success. His cruelty toward enemies was matched by surprising loyalty toward the few individuals who had shown him genuine kindness, creating a complex moral landscape that defied simple categorization as purely evil or irredeemably corrupt. The obsession with respectability that drove many of the Penguin's schemes reflected his continued desire for the social acceptance that had been denied him throughout his life, leading to elaborate attempts to purchase legitimacy through charitable donations, cultural patronage, and political contributions that created ironic situations where his criminal activities funded the very institutions that would condemn him if his true nature were revealed. The collection of rare birds that the Penguin maintained in his various hideouts served both practical and psychological purposes, providing him with loyal companions who would never judge his appearance, while also supplying him with living weapons that could be trained to attack his enemies on command. These creatures represented the family he had never truly possessed, and the beauty that his own form had been denied. The tailored suits that became the Penguin's trademark represented his attempt to impose order and elegance upon a form that nature had seemingly designed as a cruel joke. Each perfectly fitted garment serving as armor against the judgments of those who would reduce him to his physical abnormalities. The formal wear that might have seemed ridiculous on his misshapen frame instead became a statement of defiance against conventional standards of appearance and acceptability. The monocle that completed his gentlemanly ensemble served practical purposes for his vision, while also functioning as a symbol of the aristocratic pretensions that he had never fully abandoned, despite his criminal career. This affectation connected him to the social class that had rejected him, while also mocking their pretensions through his criminal appropriation of their symbols and mannerisms. The various schemes that the Penguin devised over the years consistently reflected his dual nature as both sophisticated criminal mastermind and wounded child, seeking validation from a society that would never accept him. His most elaborate plans often involved forcing Gotham's social elite to acknowledge his intelligence and capabilities, creating scenarios where their survival depended upon recognizing the worth that they had previously denied. The political ambitions that occasionally surfaced in the Penguin's activities represented the ultimate expression of his desire for respectability and social acceptance. The fantasy that he could transform his criminal success into legitimate authority that would force his former tormentors to treat him with the respect he had always craved. These campaigns invariably failed not because of his criminal background, but because his fundamental inability to connect with ordinary people made him unsuitable for democratic politics. The relationship between the Penguin and other members of Gotham's criminal elite was complicated by his aristocratic pretensions and intellectual superiority, which created resentment among colleagues who viewed him as an outsider attempting to impose social hierarchies upon a realm that was supposed to operate according to different principles. His success in criminal enterprises could not entirely overcome the prejudices that followed him even into the underworld. The attempts to rehabilitate the Penguin and address the psychological wounds that had driven his transformation met with limited success, hindered by the depth of his early trauma and his complete identification with the criminal persona he had constructed. The wounded child who had become the sophisticated villain could not easily be separated from the protective shell that had enabled his survival in a hostile world. The legitimate business interests that the Penguin occasionally pursued represented genuine attempts to achieve the respectability that he had always desired, yet these ventures were invariably corrupted by his criminal connections and his inability to resist using illegal methods to gain advantages over competitors. His understanding of business was sophisticated, but his moral flexibility made sustainable legitimacy impossible to achieve. The loneliness that characterized the Penguin's existence despite his criminal success and social connections reflected the fundamental isolation of someone who had never experienced genuine acceptance or unconditional love. The associates who surrounded him were motivated by fear or greed rather than affection, creating a social environment that replicated the conditional relationships that had defined his childhood. The art collection that the Penguin accumulated through both purchase and theft served as another attempt to surround himself with beauty that his own appearance had been denied, creating private spaces where he could appreciate aesthetic perfection while being constantly reminded of his own physical inadequacies. These treasures became substitutes for the human connections that had proven impossible to forge through conventional means. The charity work that the Penguin occasionally engaged in represented complex attempts to purchase moral legitimacy while also expressing genuine empathy for others who had been rejected or marginalized by mainstream society. His donations to organizations serving disabled children reflected his understanding of what it meant to be judged solely on physical appearance rather than character or capability. The relationship between the Penguin and the media was carefully managed to present an image of eccentric but harmless businessman whose unusual appearance and behavioral quirks made him a colorful figure rather than a dangerous criminal. This public persona served as protection against law enforcement scrutiny, while also feeding his need for attention and recognition from the broader community. The fear that the Penguin inspired in his enemies came not from physical intimidation, but from his reputation for sophisticated revenge and his ability to destroy lives through careful manipulation of social and economic systems. His threats carried weight because everyone understood that his intelligence and resources made him capable of following through on even the most elaborate promises of retribution. The seasonal patterns that characterized many of the Penguin's criminal schemes reflected his understanding of Gotham's social calendar and his desire to maximize the psychological impact of his activities by striking when his big actions would receive maximum attention from the society that had rejected him. His crimes were performances designed as much for their symbolic value as their practical benefits. The legacy of the Penguin's criminal career extended beyond his individual achievements to influence the entire structure of Gotham's underworld, demonstrating that physical appearance need not be destiny, and that intelligence could triumph over prejudice when channeled through sufficiently ruthless determination. His success inspired other outcasts to pursue criminal careers, while also serving as a warning about the social costs of systematic rejection and marginalization. In the depths of his criminal empire, surrounded by the symbols of success and respectability that he had purchased through violence and terror, Oswald Cobblepot sat in his perfectly tailored suits and contemplated the twisted path that had led him from the drawing rooms of his youth to the underworld throne he now occupied. The umbrellas that lined his office walls were monuments to transformation, symbols of how the instruments of childhood protection had become weapons of adult aggression, reminders that society's cruelest children often grew up to become its most dangerous adults. The mirror that reflected his grotesque features also showed the aristocratic bearing that he had cultivated despite his physical limitations, the proof that breeding and class were matters of behavior rather than biology, that respectability could be performed even by those whom nature had seemingly designed to embody its opposite. He had become the Penguin not because fate had demanded it, but because society had given him no choice but to transform his deformities into his greatest strengths. In the sterile corridors of Arkham Asylum, where the greatest criminal minds of Gotham find themselves confined behind walls that echo with the whispers of unsolved puzzles and unanswered questions, no patient file carries more intellectual weight than Patient File 0012. The comprehensive record of Edward Nashton, though he has long since abandoned that mundane appellation in favor of the more theatrical designation of the Riddler. His story is one of brilliant intellect corrupted by narcissistic obsession, of genius twisted into a compulsive need to prove superiority over all who would dare challenge his mental prowess. Yet beneath the elaborate puzzles and death traps lies the wounded psyche of a child who learned too early that intelligence without love was merely another form of isolation. The origins of the man who would become Gotham's Prince of Puzzles trace back to a childhood defined by emotional neglect and systematic abuse that planted the seeds of his pathological need for recognition and validation through intellectual superiority. Edward Nashton was born into circumstances that should have nurtured his exceptional mental gifts, yet instead created an environment where intelligence became both shield against cruelty and weapon against those who would diminish his sense of self-worth through physical intimidation and psychological manipulation. The father who should have recognized and encouraged his son's remarkable intellectual capabilities instead viewed Edward's precocious intelligence as a threat to parental authority and a source of embarrassment in social situations where the child's advanced vocabulary and complex reasoning made adults uncomfortable with their own intellectual limitations. The beatings that followed Edward's attempts to demonstrate his knowledge were not random acts of violence, but systematic attempts to suppress capabilities that the elder Nashton could neither understand nor appreciate. The school environment that Edward entered with such hope and enthusiasm quickly became another battlefield where his intellectual gifts created as many enemies as allies, for children possessed an instinctive ability to identify and punish those who were different, whether through physical abnormalities or mental superiority. The teachers who should have protected and nurtured his exceptional capabilities instead often viewed him as a disruptive presence whose advanced understanding of subject matter threatened their authority and exposed their own pedagogical limitations. The puzzle competitions that provided Edward with his first taste of genuine recognition and validation became the foundation upon which his entire identity would be constructed. For here at last was an arena where his intelligence was not merely tolerated but celebrated, where his ability to solve complex problems faster than his peers translated into tangible rewards and public acknowledgement of his superior capabilities. The trophies and certificates that accumulated in his bedroom became shrines to his intellectual prowess and proof that his worth as a human being could be measured and confirmed through competitive achievement. The cheating incident that would forever alter Edward's relationship with honest competition occurred during a contest where the stakes seemed high enough to justify bending the rules that had previously governed his pursuit of intellectual recognition. The discovery of his deception brought not merely disqualification but public humiliation that exposed the fundamental insecurity underlying his competitive drive and revealed the extent to which his self-worth depended upon external validation of his mental superiority. The psychological transformation that followed this public exposure created within Edward a complex relationship with rules and regulations that would define the remainder of his existence, for he had learned that conventional systems of competition could be manipulated by those clever enough to understand their weaknesses while maintaining the facade of legitimate participation. The lesson was not that cheating was wrong, but that getting caught was unforgivable, that true intelligence lay not in following rules but in understanding them well enough to circumvent them without detection. The obsession with riddles and puzzles that would eventually consume Edward's entire existence began as a healthy outlet for his intellectual energy and need for mental stimulation, yet gradually evolved into something far more pathological as his social isolation increased and his opportunities for normal human connection diminished. The cryptic challenges that he created for himself and others became substitutes for genuine conversation and meaningful relationships. Elaborate intellectual exercises that demonstrated his superiority while simultaneously preventing the kind of vulnerable communication that true intimacy required. The transformation from Edward Nashton to the Riddler was not a sudden metamorphosis, but a gradual evolution that occurred as his legitimate outlets for intellectual achievement were systematically eliminated through personal failures and professional disappointments that convinced him that society was too stupid to appreciate his genuine contributions. The green costume and question mark motifs that became his trademark were not arbitrary choices, but carefully selected symbols that announced his intention to challenge and confuse a world that had failed to recognize his exceptional capabilities. The criminal career that the Riddler embarked upon was motivated not by greed or conventional criminal ambition, but by a pathological need to demonstrate intellectual superiority over law enforcement agencies and rival criminals who he viewed as intellectually inferior beings incapable of matching his puzzle-solving abilities. Each elaborate scheme was designed not merely to achieve practical criminal objectives, but to showcase his mental prowess through challenges that would force his opponents to acknowledge his superior intelligence. The compulsion to leave clues at crime scenes was not a weakness or oversight, but the fundamental purpose of the Riddler's criminal activities. For the puzzles themselves were more important than the crimes they facilitated, each riddle serving as both intellectual challenge and proof of his mental superiority over those who would attempt to stop him. The inability to resist this compulsion reflected not stupidity, but the complete identification of his ego with his reputation as an unsolvable puzzle creator. The relationship between the Riddler and Batman became the defining obsession of his criminal career, for in the Dark Knight he had finally found an opponent whose detective abilities and intellectual capabilities approached his own, creating the kind of worthy adversary that could provide meaningful validation of his superior mental powers. Their cat and mouse games were elaborate intellectual duels, where the stakes went far beyond simple criminal success to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence and the meaning of intellectual achievement. The death traps and elaborate scenarios that the Riddler constructed for his victims were not mere murder devices, but complex puzzles that demonstrated his understanding of human psychology, engineering principles, and game theory, while providing multiple opportunities for his intellectual superiority to be displayed and acknowledged. The victims who died in these contraptions were less important than the puzzles themselves. Human elements in mathematical equations that tested both the creator's ingenuity and the solver's capabilities. The narcissistic personality disorder that defined the Riddler's psychological profile manifested itself through grandiose fantasies of intellectual superiority, constant need for admiration and recognition, and complete inability to empathize with victims who suffered as a result of his puzzle-making compulsions. His self-image was entirely dependent upon maintaining his reputation as the most intelligent criminal in Gotham, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who understood his psychological needs. The various hideouts and headquarters that the Riddler established throughout his criminal career were elaborate monuments to his intellectual achievements, filled with trophies, awards, and reminders of puzzles successfully created and problems brilliantly solved. Yet these spaces also reflected the profound loneliness of someone whose intelligence had become both his greatest asset and his most effective barrier against human connection and emotional intimacy. The henchmen who worked for the Riddler were selected not for their criminal capabilities or loyalty, but for their willingness to serve as audience for his intellectual performances and validation for his superior mental abilities. These subordinates were required to express constant amazement at his puzzle-creating skills while also serving as test subjects for new riddles and challenges that would eventually be deployed against more worthy opponents like Batman and the Gotham City Police Department. The psychological warfare that the Riddler employed against his enemies was based upon his understanding that most people's self-worth was tied to their intellectual capabilities and that systematic demonstration of mental inferiority could be more devastating than physical torture or financial ruin. His riddles were designed not merely to confuse, but to humiliate, each unsolved puzzle serving as proof of the solver's intellectual inadequacy and the creator's mental supremacy. The legitimate career opportunities that the Riddler abandoned in favor of criminal activities represented paths toward recognition and achievement that required collaborative effort and acknowledgement of others' contributions, characteristics that his narcissistic personality made impossible to sustain. His need to be the sole source of intellectual brilliance in any enterprise made him unsuitable for academic research, corporate consulting, or other fields where his abilities might have been constructively channeled. The relationship between the Riddler and other members of Gotham's criminal community was complicated by his intellectual arrogance and condescending attitude toward colleagues whose criminal methods he viewed as crude and unsophisticated compared to his elaborate puzzle-based schemes. His inability to work effectively with others limited his criminal achievements, while also isolating him from potential allies who might have provided emotional support and practical assistance. The therapeutic interventions attempted at Arkham Asylum focused on addressing the underlying narcissistic pathology that drove the Riddler's compulsive behavior, yet these treatments were consistently undermined by his inability to acknowledge that his puzzle-making obsession was anything other than the natural expression of superior intellectual capabilities. His complete identification with his criminal persona made it impossible to separate the healthy aspects of his intelligence from the pathological need for constant validation and recognition. The technological sophistication of the Riddler's puzzles and death traps demonstrated his mastery of multiple scientific and engineering disciplines, yet these capabilities were entirely devoted to creating increasingly elaborate demonstrations of intellectual superiority rather than contributing to human knowledge or societal advancement. His inventions were sterile exercises in applied intelligence that served no purpose beyond showcasing their creator's mental prowess. The pattern recognition abilities that made the Riddler such an effective puzzle creator also enabled him to identify and exploit weaknesses in security systems, investigative procedures, and human psychology that gave him significant advantages over law enforcement agencies, whose methods were based on conventional approaches to criminal investigation. His understanding of how normal minds processed information allowed him to create challenges that were specifically designed to confuse and misdirect his intellectual inferiors. The obsession with fairness that characterized many of the Riddler's challenges reflected his need to prove that his victories were achieved through superior intelligence rather than unfair advantages or cheating, creating elaborate rule systems that governed his criminal activities, while also providing additional opportunities for intellectual display. These self-imposed constraints demonstrated both his commitment to intellectual integrity and his psychological need to prove his mental supremacy through legitimate competition. The various identities and personas that the Riddler adopted throughout his criminal career were all variations on the same basic theme of intellectual superiority, whether presenting himself as a game show host, puzzle master, or criminal mastermind, each role providing different opportunities to display his mental capabilities, while maintaining the fundamental character of someone whose worth was entirely defined by his ability to create and solve complex problems. The educational background that the Riddler possessed in multiple academic disciplines enabled him to create interdisciplinary puzzles that demonstrated his broad knowledge, while also serving as implicit criticism of specialists who lacked his comprehensive understanding of diverse fields. His riddles often required knowledge of history, literature, science, mathematics, and popular culture, creating challenges that showcased the breadth of his intellectual achievements. The competitive relationships that the Riddler maintained with other puzzle creators and intellectual criminals reflected his need to establish clear hierarchies of mental ability while also providing him with opponents worthy of his resin skills. These rivalries were more important to him than the practical outcomes of his criminal schemes, for they provided validation of his reputation as the supreme puzzle master of the criminal world. The media attention that the Riddler's crimes generated was both desired and problematic, providing him with the public recognition that his ego demanded, while also increasing law enforcement pressure and reducing his operational security. His relationship with journalists and broadcasters was carefully managed to maximize positive coverage of his intellectual achievements, while minimizing focus on the victims who suffered as a result of his puzzle-making compulsions. The seasonal and thematic patterns that characterized many of the Riddler's criminal schemes reflected his understanding of symbolic systems and his desire to create intellectual challenges that operated on multiple levels of meaning and interpretation. These elaborate conceptual frameworks demonstrated his ability to think in abstract terms, while also providing additional opportunities for observers to appreciate the sophistication of his mental processes. The legacy of the Riddler's criminal career extended beyond his individual achievements to influence the entire field of criminal investigation, forcing law enforcement agencies to develop new approaches to puzzle solving and code breaking, while also inspiring other intellectually oriented criminals to adopt similar methods. His impact on popular culture and educational practices reflected the broader fascination with puzzles and intellectual challenges that his activities had helped to popularize. The relationship between the Riddler and his victims was characterized by complete emotional detachment and instrumental use of human beings as components in intellectual exercises, reflecting the narcissistic personality disorder that prevented him from experiencing genuine empathy or concern for others' welfare. The suffering that his puzzles caused was irrelevant compared to the intellectual satisfaction of creating unsolvable challenges and the ego gratification of proving his mental superiority. The philosophical implications of the Riddler's worldview encompassed fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, the meaning of intellectual achievement, and the relationship between mental capability and human worth, that reflected his complete identification of personal value with cognitive performance. His belief that intelligence was the only meaningful measure of human significance created a moral framework that justified any action that demonstrated superior mental capabilities. In the depths of Arkham Asylum, surrounded by the elaborate puzzle boxes and intellectual trophies that decorated his cell, Edward Nashton sat in his green costume and contemplated the mathematical perfection of his latest riddle, each word carefully chosen and every syllable precisely calculated to create the optimal balance of challenge and solvability. The question marks that covered his clothing were not mere decorative elements but symbols of his fundamental approach to existence, his belief that life itself was nothing more than an elaborate puzzle waiting to be solved by minds sophisticated enough to appreciate its complexity. The mirror that reflected his costumed figure also showed the wounded child who had learned that love was conditional upon achievement, that recognition was earned through competition, and that intellectual superiority was the only reliable source of self-worth in a world that measured human value through comparative performance. He had become the Riddler not because fate had demanded it, but because society had taught him that intelligence without validation was meaningless, that brilliance without audience was merely another form of isolation, and that the only way to prove his worth was to create puzzles so complex that their solution would force others to acknowledge his mental supremacy. In the greenhouse sanctuaries of Arkham Asylum, where even the most carefully tended flora seems to wither beneath the weight of accumulated madness. Few patient files evoke such complex emotions as patient file 0089, the comprehensive record of Dr. Pamela Lillian Isley, though she has long since transcended her human nomenclature to embrace the verdant identity of poison ivy. Her transformation from passionate botanist to eco-terrorist represents one of the most profound metamorphoses in the annals of criminal psychology, a journey from nurturing scientist to vengeful guardian of the plant kingdom that speaks to the terrible consequences when love of nature becomes hatred of humanity. The woman who would become the green goddess of Gotham's underworld began her existence as a child whose affinity for growing things manifested itself in gardens that bloomed with impossible beauty under her tender care, yet whose early experiences with human cruelty would plant the seeds of misanthropy that would eventually consume her capacity for compassion toward her own species. Pamela Isley's childhood was marked by the contrast between her natural empathy for plants and her growing awareness of humanity's callous destruction of the natural world that she instinctively understood and protected. The academic brilliance that defined Pamela's early career in botanical research was matched by a passionate commitment to environmental preservation that drove her to pursue increasingly radical solutions to the ecological crises that threatened the planet's survival. Her doctoral dissertation on the symbiotic relationships between plant and animal life revealed a mind capable of understanding complex biological systems while also demonstrating an emotional connection to nature that transcended mere scientific interest to approach religious devotion. The university position that provided Pamela with access to advanced research facilities and unlimited funding for her environmental studies also exposed her to the corporate influences and political pressures that consistently subordinated ecological concerns to economic considerations, creating within her a growing awareness that conventional scientific channels would never provide adequate protection for the natural world she sought to preserve and defend. The mentor who guided Pamela's early research into plant toxins and biochemical defense mechanisms was himself corrupted by commercial interests and government contracts that perverted pure scientific inquiry into weapons development and industrial applications that directly contradicted the environmental values that had motivated her initial interest in botanical studies. The betrayal represented by his transformation from teacher to exploiter would prove to be a crucial factor in her psychological development and eventual criminal transformation. The experimental procedures that would ultimately transform Pamela from human scientist into plant-human hybrid began as legitimate research into the biochemical properties of rare and endangered species whose unique characteristics might provide insights into natural defense mechanisms and adaptive strategies. Her willingness to serve as a test subject for these experiments reflected both her scientific dedication and her growing belief that humanity's survival depended upon learning to coexist with, rather than dominate, the natural world. The laboratory accident that exposed Pamela to massive concentrations of plant toxins and experimental chemicals was not truly accidental, but the result of deliberate sabotage by corporate interests who viewed her environmental activism and research findings as threats to profitable industries that depended upon continued exploitation of natural resources. The poisoning that nearly killed her also fundamentally altered her physiology in ways that conventional medicine could neither explain nor reverse. The weeks of agony that followed her transformation were marked by cellular changes that gradually replaced human biological systems with hybrid mechanisms that combined animal and plant characteristics in unprecedented configurations. Her skin became chlorophyll-enhanced, capable of photosynthesis, and immune to most toxins, while her blood chemistry was altered to produce pheromones and natural poisons that could kill with a kiss or a touch. The psychological impact of this physical transformation was as profound as the biological changes, for Pamela found herself literally becoming the bridge between plant and animal kingdoms that her research had always studied from the outside. Her enhanced connection to plant life came at the cost of her ability to form normal relationships with humans, whose touch had become potentially lethal and whose presence increasingly disturbed her developing plant consciousness. The emergence of the poison ivy persona represented not merely the adoption of a criminal identity, but the complete rejection of human civilization and values in favor of a worldview that prioritized plant life over human concerns, viewed environmental destruction as a crime deserving of the crimes deserving. Death penalty. The green costume and plant motifs that became her trademark were not theatrical affectations but genuine expressions of her transformed identity and allegiances. The eco-terrorism that defined Poison Ivy's criminal career was motivated not by personal gain or psychological pathology, but by genuine belief that humanity represented an existential threat to the planet that could only be addressed through systematic reduction of human population and industrial capacity. Her crimes were acts of war against a species that she no longer considered herself to belong to. Strategic strikes in a campaign to save the Earth from human destruction. The various schemes that Poison Ivy devised over the years consistently reflected her understanding of biological systems and ecological relationships, employing plant-based weapons and natural toxins to eliminate targets, while also demonstrating the power and sophistication of the natural world that humanity had consistently underestimated and abused. Her methods were as much educational demonstrations as criminal acts, designed to force recognition of nature's capabilities and humanity's vulnerabilities. The seduction and manipulation techniques that became Poison Ivy's signature methods of operation were based upon her enhanced pheromone production and psychological understanding of human mating behaviors, yet they also reflected her complete contempt for the emotional and intellectual weakness that made humans susceptible to such basic biological manipulation. Her victims were chosen not randomly, but as representatives of industries and institutions that contributed to environmental destruction. The relationship between Poison Ivy and Batman was complicated by their shared commitment to protecting the innocent, though they defined innocence in fundamentally different ways that made cooperation impossible despite occasional overlapping interests. Where Batman sought to preserve human life and social order, Poison Ivy prioritized plant life and ecological balance, creating philosophical conflicts that could not be resolved through compromise or negotiation. The various hideouts and headquarters that Poison Ivy established throughout Gotham were elaborate greenhouse complexes that served both as criminal bases and sanctuaries for endangered plant species that she had rescued from human destruction. These spaces represented her vision of what the world could become if human influence were eliminated or dramatically reduced, paradises of botanical beauty that required constant protection from civilization's encroachment. The plant minions that served Poison Ivy were not mere tools or weapons, but genuine companions whose loyalty and affection provided emotional connections that human relationships could no longer offer safely. Her ability to communicate with and control plant life was both a supernatural gift and a compensation for the isolation that her transformation had imposed upon her relationships with her own species. The various romantic entanglements that Poison Ivy engaged in were always tragic affairs, for her enhanced biochemistry made normal physical intimacy impossible without protective measures that prevented genuine emotional connection. The men who fell under her influence were doomed either to death through her toxic touch or to psychological slavery through her pheromone manipulation, creating relationships that mocked the very concept of love while demonstrating her power over human weakness. The feminist themes that characterized many of Poison Ivy's crimes reflected her understanding that environmental destruction was closely connected to patriarchal systems of domination and control that treated both women and nature as resources to be exploited rather than entities deserving of respect and protection. Her attacks on corporate executives and government officials were often specifically targeted at male authority figures whose decisions had caused ecological damage. The alliance between Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn represented one of the few genuine emotional connections that she was able to maintain after her transformation, for their shared status as Arkham inmates and fellow criminals created common ground that transcended the species' boundaries that had become so problematic in her other relationships. Their friendship was based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than manipulation or exploitation. The seasonal patterns that governed many of Poison Ivy's criminal activities reflected her deep connection to natural cycles and growing seasons that had replaced human social calendars as the organizing principles of her existence. Her crimes were often timed to coincide with botanical events like blooming periods or harvest seasons that held significance within her plant-centered worldview. The scientific knowledge that Poison Ivy possessed about biochemistry, toxicology, and environmental systems made her one of the most dangerous criminals in Gotham, for her understanding of biological processes enabled her to create weapons and scenarios that conventional law enforcement was unprepared to address. Her expertise in plant biology was combined with criminal creativity to produce threats that operated according to natural rather than technological principles. The various attempts to cure or reverse Poison Ivy's transformation met with limited success because her condition was not merely biological, but also psychological and philosophical, representing a complete identification with plant life that she experienced as evolution rather than corruption. Her resistance to treatment was based not on mental illness but on genuine belief that her transformed state was superior to normal human existence. The environmental message that Poison Ivy's crimes were intended to convey was often lost amid the violence and criminality of her methods. Yet, her actions did succeed in drawing attention to ecological issues that might otherwise have been ignored by media and government agencies focused on more immediate human concerns. Her terrorism was counterproductive to her stated goals, yet it forced recognition of environmental problems that conventional activism had failed to address. The pharmaceutical and chemical industries that were frequent targets of Poison Ivy's attacks represented the corporate interests that she held responsible for both her personal transformation and the broader environmental destruction that motivated her criminal career. Her intimate knowledge of these industries' practices and vulnerabilities made her attacks particularly effective, while also demonstrating the connections between personal and ecological trauma. The relationship between Poison Ivy and other eco-terrorists and environmental activists was complicated by her extreme methods and misanthropic philosophy, which made her unsuitable as an ally for groups that sought to protect the environment while also preserving human life and welfare. Her willingness to use lethal force against anyone who threatened plant life made her too dangerous for mainstream environmental organizations to support or collaborate with. The medical applications of Poison Ivy's enhanced biochemistry and plant-based toxins represented potentially revolutionary advances in pharmaceutical research and treatment development, yet her criminal status and unwillingness to cooperate with legitimate researchers prevented these discoveries from being developed for beneficial purposes. Her transformation had created opportunities for medical breakthroughs that her misanthropy made impossible to realize. The psychological profile that emerged from extended study of Poison Ivy revealed a mind that had retained its scientific training and intellectual capabilities, while developing emotional connections and moral frameworks that prioritized non-human life over human welfare. Her mental health was complicated by the question of whether her plant-centered worldview represented pathology or simply an alternative value system that challenged anthropocentric assumptions about moral priority. The various identities and personas that Poison Ivy adopted throughout her criminal career were all variations on themes of natural beauty and botanical power, whether presenting herself as an earth goddess, environmental avenger, or plant queen, each role providing different opportunities to express her transformed identity, while maintaining consistent commitment to protecting plant life and punishing environmental destruction. The technological integration that Poison Ivy achieved between biological and mechanical systems enabled her to create hybrid devices that combined natural and artificial components in ways that maximized both effectiveness and symbolic impact. Her inventions demonstrated the potential for cooperation between natural and technological systems, while also serving as weapons in her war against industrial civilization. The agricultural knowledge that Poison Ivy possessed enabled her to develop new strains of plants with enhanced defensive capabilities and improved resistance to pollution and environmental damage, creating species that could survive in conditions where natural varieties would perish. Her botanical innovations represented genuine contributions to conservation efforts despite being developed for criminal purposes. The loneliness that characterized Poison Ivy's existence was intensified by her inability to form normal human relationships without causing harm through her toxic biochemistry, and by her growing identification with plant life that operated according to fundamentally different principles from animal consciousness. Her transformation had granted her extraordinary powers, while isolating her from her own species in ways that could never be fully reversed. In the verdant sanctuary of her Arkham cell, surrounded by the carefully tended plants that provided her only reliable companions and emotional support, Pamela Isley sat among her green charges and contemplated the terrible irony of her existence as humanity's greatest enemy and nature's most devoted protector. The flowers that bloomed at her touch were more responsive to her emotional needs than any human lover had ever been, while the vines that grew according to her provided more reliable assistance than any human ally could offer. The mirror that reflected her chlorophyll-enhanced features also showed the passionate scientist who had once believed that research and education could save the world from environmental destruction, whose transformation into an instrument of ecological vengeance represented both personal tragedy and natural evolution. She had become Poison Ivy not through choice but through circumstance. Yet, her embrace of this identity reflected genuine conviction that humanity deserved the fate she sought to impose upon it for its crimes against the natural world that had become her true family and spiritual home. In the shadowed halls of Arkham Asylum, where nightmares take human form and terror wears the guise of twisted science, no patient file evokes more primal dread than Patient File 0156, the meticulously documented record of Dr. Jonathan Crane, whose transformation from academic psychologist to the embodiment of fear itself represents one of the most chilling examples of how intellectual curiosity can be corrupted into instruments of psychological torture. His journey from respected researcher to the creature known as Scarecrow illuminates the darkest corners of human psychology, while demonstrating how childhood trauma can metastasize into adult pathology that threatens the sanity of everyone who encounters its malevolent manifestations. The origins of the man who would become Gotham's master of fear trace back to a childhood so saturated with terror and helplessness that it created within him both an intimate understanding of fear's mechanisms and a pathological, need to transform from victim to perpetrator, from the one who trembles to the one who causes trembling. Jonathan Crane's earliest memories were painted in shades of anxiety and dread. His formative years shaped by forces beyond his control that taught him fear was not merely an emotion, but a fundamental aspect of existence that governed all human behavior and social interaction. The grandmother who raised Jonathan after his parents' deaths was herself a creature of rigid religious fanaticism and psychological cruelty, using biblical quotations and moral condemnation as weapons to terrorize a child whose only crimes were natural curiosity and innocent questions about the world around him. Her twisted interpretation of Christian doctrine transformed love into conditional approval based upon absolute obedience, creating within young Jonathan an understanding that affection was always temporary and could be withdrawn without warning or explanation. The scarecrow that dominated the cornfield behind his grandmother's house became both the symbol of his childhood terror and the inspiration for his adult criminal persona, its ragged form standing as a monument to the power of fear to control behavior and shape perception. The countless hours that Jonathan spent staring at that motionless guardian filled him with a complex mixture of dread and fascination that would eventually evolve into professional obsession with the psychological mechanisms that govern human responses to perceived threats. The academic brilliance that Jonathan displayed from his earliest school years was matched by an antisocial tendency that prevented him from forming normal relationships with peers, who found his intense interest in psychology and fear responses deeply disturbing. His science fair projects consistently focused on experiments involving stress responses, phobias, and anxiety disorders that revealed both his intellectual capabilities and his troubling fascination with human suffering and psychological manipulation. The university education that should have provided Jonathan with constructive outlets for his intellectual gifts instead became a laboratory for exploring increasingly sophisticated methods of inducing and studying fear responses in both animal and human subjects. His graduate research into phobia development and treatment revealed a mind that was more interested in creating terror than alleviating it, though he maintained the facade of legitimate scientific inquiry throughout his academic career. The professorship that Jonathan obtained at Gotham University provided him with access to research facilities, graduate students, and human subjects that enabled increasingly elaborate and unethical experiments into the nature of fear and its applications as a tool for behavioral modification and social control. His lectures on abnormal psychology attracted students who were disturbed by both his encyclopedic knowledge of human psychological weaknesses and his obvious enjoyment in discussing methods of exploiting those vulnerabilities. The consulting work that Jonathan performed for Arkham Asylum in his capacity as a respected expert on phobias and anxiety disorders provided him with unprecedented access to patients whose existing mental health conditions made them ideal subjects for experimental fear treatments that violated every principle of medical ethics and professional responsibility. His position as both researcher and clinician created opportunities for exploitation that his increasingly disturbed psyche could not resist pursuing. The development of the fear toxin that would become Scarecrow's signature weapon began as legitimate pharmaceutical research into the neurochemical basis of phobic responses and anxiety disorders, yet gradually evolved into something far more sinister, as Jonathan's scientific curiosity was overwhelmed by his compulsive need to induce terror in others and study their psychological disintegration under controlled conditions. The transformation from Dr. Crane to Scarecrow was not a sudden metamorphosis, but a gradual evolution that occurred as his professional ethical boundaries eroded under pressure from his childhood trauma and his growing addiction to the sense of power that came from controlling others through psychological manipulation and chemically induced terror. The scarecrow costume that became his criminal uniform was both practical disguise and psychological projection of his own internalized fears onto his victims. The philosophy that drove Scarecrow's criminal activities was based upon his understanding that fear was the fundamental human emotion that governed all other responses and behaviors, that by mastering the ability to induce terror, he could exercise complete control over any individual or group that he chose to target. His crimes were not motivated by greed or conventional criminal ambition, but by an insatiable curiosity about human psychological limits and a compulsive need to prove his theories about fear's omnipotence. The various formulations of fear toxin that Scarecrow developed over the years demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of neurochemistry, pharmacology, and the biological mechanisms that governed emotional responses to perceived threats. Each new version was more potent and specific than its predecessors, designed to trigger particular phobias or create entirely new categories of terror that had never before been experienced by human consciousness. The relationship between Scarecrow and Batman was particularly complex because both men had been shaped by childhood trauma involving fear and loss, yet they had chosen opposite responses to their psychological wounds. Where Bruce Wayne had transformed his fear into motivation for protecting others, Jonathan Crane had perverted his terror into tools for tormenting innocents, making their confrontations battles between two different philosophies about how trauma should be processed and channeled. The psychological warfare that Scarecrow employed against his enemies was based upon meticulous research into their personal histories, relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities that enabled him to craft individualized terror scenarios designed to exploit their specific fears and insecurities. His attacks were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated psychological torture sessions that demonstrated his understanding of human nature's darkest aspects. The various hideouts and laboratories that Scarecrow established throughout his criminal career were elaborate theaters of terror designed to maximize the psychological impact of his fear-inducing experiments, while also serving as functional research facilities where he could develop new toxins and study their effects on both voluntary and involuntary subjects. These spaces reflected his vision of a world where fear ruled supreme over reason, compassion, and hope. The academic background that Scarecrow retained, despite his criminal transformation, enabled him to conduct sophisticated psychological research that advanced the understanding of fear responses while also developing practical applications for terror as a tool of social control and individual manipulation. His publications, though ethically horrifying, represented genuine contributions to the field of abnormal psychology. The teaching methods that Scarecrow had employed during his legitimate academic career were perverted into criminal techniques for indoctrinating followers and training subordinates in the arts of psychological torture and fear-based behavior modification. His ability to explain complex psychological concepts in accessible terms made him an effective leader for criminal organizations that relied upon terror and intimidation rather than simple violence. The patient files from Scarecrow's time at Arkham Asylum revealed systematic patterns of psychological abuse and unethical experimentation that had been conducted under the guise of legitimate treatment and research, demonstrating how professional authority could be exploited to harm those who were most vulnerable and least able to resist or report such mistreatment. His betrayal of medical ethics was as profound as his criminal activities. The seasonal and thematic patterns that characterized Scarecrow's crimes reflected his understanding of cultural fears and social anxieties that could be exploited for maximum psychological impact, with Halloween becoming his preferred time for large-scale terror operations that took advantage of existing cultural associations with fear and the supernatural. His timing was always calculated to amplify the terror that his activities generated. The relationship between Scarecrow and other fear-based criminals was complicated by his academic background and scientific approach to terror, which made him both a valuable ally and a dangerous rival to those who relied upon more primitive methods of intimidation and violence. His intellectual sophistication set him apart from common criminals, while also making him unsuitable for organizations that valued loyalty over individual achievement. The various personas and identities that Scarecrow adopted throughout his criminal career were all variations on themes of terror and psychological manipulation, whether presenting himself as a university professor, psychiatric consultant, or supernatural entity, each role providing different opportunities to access victims and conduct his fear-based experiments while maintaining cover for his criminal activities. The technological integration that Scarecrow achieved between chemical weapons and psychological warfare enabled him to create scenarios where victims experienced both pharmacologically induced terror and psychologically crafted nightmare, scenarios that reinforced and amplified each other's effects. His understanding of how chemical and psychological factors interacted made his attacks particularly devastating and difficult to treat. The therapeutic applications of Scarecrow's research into fear responses could potentially have revolutionary implications for treating phobias, anxiety disorders, and trauma-related mental health conditions. Yet his criminal methods and unethical experimentation made it impossible for legitimate researchers to build upon his discoveries without becoming complicit in his violations of medical ethics and human dignity. The philosophical implications of Scarecrow's worldview encompassed fundamental questions about the role of fear in human society, the relationship between terror and social control, and the ethical boundaries that should govern psychological research and treatment, issues that his criminal activities had explored in ways that legitimate science could never attempt or justify. The various attempts to rehabilitate Scarecrow and address the childhood trauma that had shaped his psychological development met with limited success because his identification with fear as both weapon and philosophy had become so siege, complete, that he could not conceive of existence without the power to terrorize others. His resistance to treatment was based not on mental illness, but on genuine conviction that fear was the most honest human emotion. The impact of Scarecrow's crimes on Gotham's mental health system was profound and lasting, forcing hospitals and clinics to develop new protocols for treating chemically induced phobias, while also creating widespread anxiety about psychological research and treatment that made legitimate practitioners' work more difficult. His legacy contaminated the entire field of mental health care through association with his atrocities. The agricultural and environmental knowledge that Scarecrow possessed enabled him to create biological weapons based on plant toxins and natural fear-inducing compounds that could be deployed through water supplies, air conditioning systems, or direct application to create large-scale terror events that affected entire neighborhoods or institutions. His understanding of natural systems made his attacks particularly difficult to predict or prevent. The educational reforms that Scarecrow's activities inspired included enhanced oversight of psychological research, stricter ethical guidelines for human experimentation, and improved screening procedures for mental health professionals, changes that represented attempts to prevent future individuals from following his path from legitimate researcher to criminal terrorist, while also protecting vulnerable populations from similar exploitation. The religious and cultural themes that appeared in many of Scarecrow's terror scenarios reflected his understanding of how belief systems and cultural narratives could be manipulated to create powerful fear responses that transcended individual psychology to encompass entire communities and social groups. His attacks often exploited collective anxieties and shared mythologies to maximize their psychological impact. The media coverage of Scarecrow's crimes was carefully studied and sometimes influenced by him as part of his broader strategy for spreading fear beyond his immediate victims to encompass entire populations who learned of his activities through news reports and social media. His understanding of mass communication enabled him to amplify the terror that his direct actions created through strategic manipulation of public perception and media narrative. The forensic techniques that law enforcement agencies developed to investigate Scarecrow's crimes included new methods for analyzing chemical residues, psychological profiling, approaches specific to fear-based terrorism, and protective protocols for investigators who might be exposed to residual toxins or psychologically traumatic crime scenes. His activities forced evolution in criminal investigation methods. The international implications of Scarecrow's research into fear-based weapons and psychological warfare techniques created concerns among intelligence agencies and military organizations about the potential for his methods to be adopted by terrorist groups or hostile governments, leading to increased security around psychological research facilities and enhanced monitoring of individuals working in related fields. In the sterile confines of his Arkham cell, surrounded by the psychological evaluation reports and research notes that documented both his crimes and his insights into human nature, Jonathan Crane sat in his institutional clothing and contemplated the elegant simplicity of fear as the fundamental organizing principle of human existence. The Scarecrow mask that had been confiscated upon his arrest remained visible in his mind's eye, a symbol of the power that came from embracing rather than fleeing from the terror that defined the human condition. The mirror that reflected his gaunt features also showed the frightened child who had learned that the world was a place where safety was illusion and terror was truth, whose transformation into an agent of fear represented both personal evolution and cosmic justice. He had become Scarecrow not through choice but through understanding, recognizing that in a universe governed by chaos and uncertainty, fear was the only honest response, and those who induced it were merely teachers helping others confront reality's fundamental nature. The research that had consumed his academic career and criminal activities represented a form of public service, forcing humanity to acknowledge the psychological mechanisms that governed their behavior, while stripping away the comforting delusions that prevented them from understanding their own nature. His victims had been students in the most important curriculum ever devised, lessons in the primacy of fear that would serve them well in navigating a world where terror lurked behind every moment of apparent peace and security. In the deepest chambers of Arkham Asylum, where the boundaries between human and inhuman blur into nightmare configurations that challenge every assumption about identity and form, few patient files inspire such existential dread as Patient File 0203, the ever-changing record of the entity known as Clayface. Though this designation encompasses multiple individuals whose stories have become entangled in a web of transformation, identity crisis, and the fundamental horror of existence without fixed form. The tragedy of Basil Carlo and his various successors speaks to the most primal fears about the nature of self and the terrible price that ambition can exact when it encounters forces beyond human comprehension or control. The man who would become the original Clayface began his existence as Basil Carlo, a name that once appeared on theatre, marquees, and movie posters throughout Gotham City, yet whose career was built upon the kind of classical dramatic training that had become increasingly obsolete in an entertainment industry that valued youth and commercial appeal over artistic integrity and theatrical tradition. His early success in horror films during the golden age of cinema had established him as a master of transformation and characterization. Yet these same skills would eventually become both his greatest strength and his ultimate curse. The decline of Carlo's legitimate acting career was not sudden but gradual, a slow erosion of opportunities and relevance that reflected the industry's evolution away from the gothic horror genre that had made him famous toward more modern forms of entertainment that had no place for his particular talents and theatrical sensibilities. The roles that had once challenged his abilities and satisfied his artistic ambitions were replaced by smaller parts, character roles, and eventually the humiliating prospect of unemployment in the only profession that had ever given his life meaning and purpose. The obsession with reclaiming his former glory that consumed Carlo's thoughts during his professional decline was fueled not merely by wounded pride, but by a deeper psychological need for validation and recognition that had been cultivated throughout his career. As a performer whose identity was entirely wrapped up in his ability to transform himself into other characters and personalities, the prospect of being forgotten represented not just professional failure, but existential annihilation. The horror film that had launched Carlo's career was titled The Terror, a low-budget production that had achieved unexpected success through his masterful portrayal of a vengeful killer whose crimes were motivated by artistic obsession and the desire for immortality through infamy. The irony that his life would eventually mirror his most famous role was not lost on him as he contemplated increasingly desperate measures to restore his career and reclaim his place in cinema history. The remake of The Terror, that threatened to eclipse Carlo's original performance, represented everything that he despised about the modern entertainment industry, a soulless commercial enterprise that prioritized special effects and marketing over genuine artistic achievement and character development. The young actor selected to play his most famous role embodied the superficial attractiveness and technical competence that had replaced the depth and emotional authenticity that Carlo believed were essential to true performance. The transformation from frustrated performer to homicidal maniac began with Carlo's decision to eliminate the cast and crew of the remake through methods that mirrored the murders depicted in the original film, creating a twisted form of performance art that merged reality with fiction in ways that satisfied his desperate need for attention, while also expressing his rage against an industry that had discarded him. His crimes were both revenge and audition, demonstrations of his commitment to his craft that exceeded the dedication of any contemporary performer. The clay mask that Carlo wore during his killing spree was not merely a disguise, but a symbol of his understanding that identity itself was malleable, that the boundaries between actor and character were artificial constructs that could be transcended through sufficient commitment and artistic vision. The mask represented his rejection of fixed identity in favor of fluid transformation that reflected his theatrical training and psychological needs. The capture and institutionalization that followed Carlo's murderous rampage provided him with the time and isolation necessary to contemplate the deeper implications of his transformation from performer to killer, yet also exposed him to experimental treatments and chemical compounds that would eventually grant him the literal shape-shifting abilities that had previously been limited to his acting performances and psychological fantasies. The accident that transformed Basil Carlo from human actor into living clay occurred during an escape attempt that brought him into contact with experimental chemicals and radioactive materials that were being tested for various industrial and military applications substances that reacted with his unique physiology and psychological state to produce changes that defied every known law of biology and physics. The transformation was both physical and metaphysical, altering not just his molecular structure, but his fundamental relationship to concepts of identity and form. The awakening that followed his metamorphosis revealed abilities that exceeded even his most ambitious dreams of theatrical transformation, for he had become literally capable of assuming any shape, size, or appearance that his imagination could conceive. Yet this ultimate fulfillment of his artistic aspirations came at the cost of his essential humanity and connection to the stable identity that defined individual consciousness. The psychological impact of existing as living clay was profound and disorienting, for Carlo found himself trapped between the ecstasy of unlimited transformational possibilities and the terror of no longer possessing a true form that could serve as the foundation for his sense of self. The question of who he really was became increasingly impossible to answer as his default appearance shifted constantly and his memories of his original human form grew dim and unreliable. The various incarnations of Clayface that emerged over the years reflected both the evolution of the original Basil Carlo and the tragic stories of other individuals who had encountered similar transformative substances or sought to replicate his abilities through scientific experimentation or criminal enterprise. Each new Clayface represented a different aspect of the same fundamental horror: the loss of fixed identity and the terrible freedom of unlimited transformation. The second Clayface, Matthew Hagen, was a treasure hunter whose exposure to a mystical pool of transformative clay had granted him shape-shifting abilities, while trapping him in an existence that required constant contact with the substance to maintain coherence and stability. His story illustrated the addictive nature of transformation and the price that came with abilities that demanded ongoing sacrifice and compromise to sustain. The powers that defined Clayface's existence operated according to principles that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics and biology, allowing him to alter his mass, density, and molecular structure at will, while maintaining the consciousness and memories that provided continuity across his various forms. His transformations were limited only by his imagination and understanding of the shapes and beings he sought to emulate. The relationship between Clayface and Batman was complicated by the shapeshifter's ability to assume the appearance of anyone, including the Dark Knight himself, creating situations where the hero was forced to confront questions about identity and authenticity that went far beyond normal criminal investigation. Their battles were as much psychological as physical, tests of will and identity that challenged both combatants' understanding of self and purpose. The criminal enterprises that Clayface engaged in were uniquely suited to his transformational abilities, encompassing everything from sophisticated impersonation schemes that enabled access to restricted areas and confidential information, to more direct applications of his shape-shifting powers for robbery, assassination, and espionage that conventional criminals could never attempt. His crimes were limited only by his imagination and psychological state. The loneliness that characterized Clayface's existence was perhaps more profound than that experienced by any other member of Arkham's population, for his condition made genuine relationships impossible when no one could be certain of his true appearance or authentic personality. The isolation that came with unlimited transformational ability was the price of power that normal humans could never understand or appreciate. The various attempts to cure or stabilize Clayface's condition met with limited success because his transformation had occurred on such a fundamental level that reversing it would require not just medical intervention but reconstruction of his essential identity and relationship to physical existence. The The question of whether he would want to return to human form became increasingly complex as his clay nature became more integral to his sense of self. The scientific study of Clayface's abilities provided insights into cellular regeneration, molecular manipulation, and the relationship between consciousness and physical form that had applications far beyond criminal justice or psychiatric treatment. Yet his unstable mental state and criminal behavior made sustained research collaboration impossible despite the potential benefits of his cooperation. The theatrical background that had originally defined Carlo's identity remained present even after his transformation, manifesting in his tendency to adopt dramatic personas and engage in elaborate performances that reflected his understanding of character development and narrative structure. His crimes often resembled theatrical productions, more than conventional criminal activities, complete with costumes, dialogue, and thematic coherence. The various hideouts and bases that Clayface established were temporary constructs that reflected his fluid relationship with physical space and permanent structures, creating environments that could be reshaped according to his needs, while also serving as stages for the ongoing performance that his existence had become. These spaces were extensions of his consciousness made manifest in clay and imagination. The moral questions raised by Clayface's existence encompassed fundamental issues about identity, authenticity, and the nature of personhood that had implications far beyond criminal psychology or law enforcement, touching on philosophical problems that had occupied thinkers for centuries, while adding new dimensions that had never before been possible to explore through direct observation and interaction. The relationship between the various Clayface incarnations created complex legal and practical problems for law enforcement agencies that were unprepared to deal with criminals whose identities were fluid and whose crimes might be committed by individuals who shared abilities but not necessarily memories, motivations, or legal responsibility for each other's actions. The regenerative abilities that Clayface possessed made him nearly impossible to kill through conventional means, while also raising questions about whether his consciousness was distributed throughout his clay body or localized in some essential core that could be targeted or protected. His survival capabilities exceeded those of most other criminals, while also making him more difficult to contain or permanently neutralize. The mimicry skills that defined Clayface's transformational abilities extended beyond physical appearance to encompass voice patterns, behavioral quirks, and psychological characteristics that made his impersonations nearly perfect and extremely difficult to detect through normal observation or interaction. His performances were masterpieces of method acting that transcended the boundaries between art and reality. The environmental factors that affected Clayface's stability and abilities included temperature extremes, chemical exposures, and electromagnetic fields that could disrupt his molecular cohesion, while also providing potential weaknesses that could be exploited by those who understood his unique physiology and the scientific principles that governed his transformational capabilities. The legacy of Clayface's existence in Gotham's criminal underworld influenced the development of new identification technologies, security protocols, and investigative techniques that were designed to detect and counter shape-shifting abilities, while also protecting important individuals and installations from infiltration by beings who could assume any appearance or form at identification will. The philosophical implications of Clayface's transformational abilities raised questions about the relationship between appearance and identity, the nature of authenticity in human interaction, and the psychological foundations of selfhood that had relevance far beyond the specific case of his criminal activities and psychiatric condition. His existence challenged fundamental assumptions about what it meant to be human, The artistic potential that Clayface's abilities represented remained largely unrealized due to his criminal activities and psychological instability, yet his transformational performances demonstrated levels of technical skill and creative imagination that surpassed anything achieved by conventional actors or special effects artists. His condition had granted him the ultimate tool for artistic expression while also making it impossible for him to use it constructively. The medical applications of research into Clayface's regenerative and transformational abilities could potentially revolutionize treatment of genetic disorders, traumatic injuries, and degenerative diseases, while also advancing understanding of cellular biology and tissue engineering that might benefit countless patients who suffered from conditions that conventional medicine could not adequately address. The social implications of Clayface's existence extended beyond immediate concerns about criminal activity to encompass broader questions about identity verification, social interaction, and the foundations of trust that enabled human communities to function effectively when the possibility existed that anyone might not be who they appeared to be. In the specialized containment cell designed to house his unique physiology, surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked his molecular stability and transformational activities, the entity, known as Clayface, sat in whatever form his psychological state had adopted for the moment, and contemplated the infinite possibilities and terrible limitations that defined his existence. The clay that composed his being was both ultimate freedom and absolute prison, granting him abilities that exceeded human imagination while condemning him to isolation from the very humanity he could so perfectly imitate. The mirror that reflected his current appearance showed only the latest in an endless series of masks and personas that had replaced the authentic identity he could no longer remember clearly, each transformation a performance in a play whose script he had forgotten and whose audience had long since departed. He had become Clayface, not through choice, but through the cruel logic of ambition, meeting opportunity in circumstances that transformed blessing into curse, gift into burden, art into horror. The stage upon which he had once performed for audiences who applauded his skill had expanded to encompass all of reality. Yet the applause had been replaced by screams, the appreciation by fear, the connection by isolation that no amount of transformational ability could bridge or overcome, leaving him forever alone with his infinite faces and his absent self. In the cryogenic chambers of Arkham Asylum, where frost forms eternal patterns on reinforced glass and the very air seems to crystallize with accumulated sorrow, no patient file carries more tragic weight than patient file 0178, the heartbreaking record of Dr. Victor Freeze, whose transformation from brilliant scientist to the creature known as Mr. Freeze represents perhaps the most sympathetic fall from grace in the annals of criminal psychology. His story is not one of madness or malice, but of love pushed beyond the boundaries of sanity, of devotion so absolute that it transformed the warmth of human affection into the cold mathematics of vengeance and desperation. The man who would become Gotham's most reluctant villain began his existence as Victor Freeze, a name that would appear on groundbreaking research papers and scientific journals throughout the international academic community, yet whose greatest achievement would not be measured in publications or professional recognition, but in the depth of his commitment to the woman whose love had given meaning to his otherwise solitary existence. His brilliance in the field of cryogenic research was matched only by the tenderness he showed toward his wife Nora, whose rare medical condition would eventually transform his scientific expertise from a tool of healing into an instrument of preservation and, ultimately, destruction. The love story that defined Victor's existence began in the sterile corridors of a research hospital where both he and Nora worked as dedicated professionals committed to advancing human knowledge and alleviating suffering through scientific innovation. Their courtship was conducted among test tubes and research equipment, their romance blossoming in laboratories where the mysteries of life and death were explored with clinical precision. Yet their emotional connection transcended the cold rationality of their professional environment to create something genuinely warm and human. The marriage that united Victor and Nora Fries represented not merely a personal commitment, but a scientific partnership that combined their individual expertise into research projects that pushed the boundaries of medical knowledge while also deepening their emotional bond through shared purpose and mutual respect. Their collaboration was both professional and personal, each supporting the other's work, while also finding in their partnership the kind of intellectual and emotional fulfillment that made their individual achievements meaningful. The diagnosis that would ultimately destroy their happiness came without warning or preparation. A medical verdict that sentenced Nora to a progressive degenerative condition that conventional medicine could neither cure nor meaningfully slow, creating within Victor a desperate urgency to find solutions that existed beyond the current boundaries of scientific possibility. Her illness was not merely a medical challenge, but an existential crisis that threatened to rob him of the only person who had ever made his intellectual achievements feel worthwhile. The experimental treatment that Victor developed for his wife's condition represented the culmination of years of research into cryogenic preservation and suspended animation, techniques that had shown promise in laboratory settings, but had never been tested on human subjects under conditions where failure meant not just professional disappointment, but personal devastation. His willingness to stake everything on unproven science reflected both his scientific confidence and his complete inability to accept the possibility of life without Nora. The corporate interference that would ultimately doom Victor's attempts to save his wife came from executives and administrators who viewed his research not as a desperate attempt to preserve human life, but as an expensive experiment whose potential profits were uncertain and whose continued funding represented an unacceptable risk to shareholder interests. Their decision to terminate his research and seize his equipment was motivated by cold financial calculation that took no account of the human stakes involved in his work. The confrontation that destroyed Victor's laboratory and transformed him from brilliant scientist into criminal occurred when corporate security forces attempted to shut down his cryogenic preservation efforts before Nora could be safely placed in suspended animation, creating a situation where he was forced to choose between compliance with authority and protection of the woman whose life depended upon the continuation of his research. His resistance to their interference was motivated not by criminal intent but by love that transcended legal and corporate authority. The accident that gave Victor his cryogenic powers while simultaneously destroying his laboratory was the result of corporate sabotage and safety violations that exposed him to experimental chemicals and extreme cold temperatures that should have killed him instantly, but instead transformed his physiology in ways that conventional medicine could neither explain nor reverse. His survival came at the cost of his ability to exist in normal temperatures, creating a condition that was both supernatural gift and unbearable curse. The awakening that followed his transformation revealed abilities that made him nearly immune to cold, while also requiring him to exist in sub-zero temperatures that were lethal to normal humans, creating a barrier between himself and all other forms of life that condemned him to isolation, even as it granted him power over ice and frost that could serve his desperate quest to restore his wife to health and consciousness. His condition was both the answer to his prayers and the punishment for his hubris. The realization that Nora had been lost during the laboratory destruction created within Victor a grief so profound that it transformed his personality from gentle scientist to cold avenger. Yet his dedication to preserving and eventually reviving her remained the central organizing principle of his existence, even as his methods became increasingly criminal and his worldview increasingly distorted by loss and isolation. Her absence was the void around which everything else orbited. The crimes that Victor committed as Mr. Freeze were not motivated by greed or madness, but by the desperate need to acquire resources and equipment necessary for continuing his cryogenic research and preserving what remained of his wife's body until science could advance sufficiently to restore her to life and health. His theft and violence were means toward the end of resurrection, criminal activities justified in his mind by their ultimate humanitarian purpose. The costume that became Mr. Freeze's trademark was not theatrical affectation, but technological necessity, a specialized environmental suit that enabled him to survive in normal temperatures, while also serving as a mobile cryogenic laboratory, equipped with weapons and equipment necessary for both criminal activities and scientific research. His appearance was determined by function rather than aesthetics, yet it created an iconic image that reflected his fundamental separation from normal human existence. The philosophy that governed Mr. Freeze's actions was based upon the conviction that love justified any action, that the preservation of life was a moral imperative that superseded legal and social conventions, and that science had the obligation to push beyond conventional ethical boundaries when human survival was at stake. His worldview was simultaneously noble and monstrous, motivated by the highest human emotions, while expressing itself through the coldest criminal methods. The relationship between Mr. Freeze and Batman was complicated by the hero's recognition that Victor's crimes were motivated by love rather than evil, creating moral complexities that could not be resolved through simple applications of justice or punishment. Their confrontations were battles between different interpretations of devotion and responsibility, conflicts that tested both men's understanding of what it meant to protect those they cared about most. The various schemes that Mr. Freeze devised over the years consistently reflected his scientific background and his single-minded focus on acquiring resources for his cryogenic research, whether through theft of equipment and materials, extortion of wealthy individuals and corporations, or collaboration with other criminals whose goals aligned temporarily with his own desperate mission. His crimes were always means rather than ends, tools for achieving the resurrection that defined his existence. The seasonal patterns that characterized many of Mr. Freeze's criminal activities were dictated both by the practical requirements of his condition, which made winter operations easier and more comfortable, and by his psychological association of cold with preservation and hope. Seasonal timing that also maximized the dramatic impact of his ice-based weapons and freeze-ray technology on a population that expected warmth and comfort during the coldest months of the year. The scientific knowledge that Mr. Freeze possessed enabled him to create weapons and equipment that operated according to principles of thermodynamics and cryogenic physics that gave him significant advantages over opponents who were unprepared for attacks based on extreme cold and ice. Manipulation. His understanding of how low temperatures affected human physiology and mechanical systems made him uniquely dangerous in ways that conventional criminals could not match. The various hideouts and laboratories that Mr. Freeze established were elaborate cryogenic facilities designed to support both his survival needs and his ongoing research into preservation and resurrection techniques, spaces that maintained sub-zero temperatures while also serving as shrines to his wife's memory and monuments to his unwavering commitment to their eventual reunion. These environments were extensions of his transformed psychology made manifest in ice and steel. The preserved body of Nora Fries became the central focus of Victor's criminal enterprise and the emotional core around which all his activities were organized, her suspended form serving as both inspiration for his continued efforts and reminder of what he had lost through the interference of those who placed profit above human life. Her presence was absence, her silence more powerful than any words she might have spoken. The loneliness that defined Mr. Freeze's existence was intensified by his physical isolation in environments that were deadly to normal humans, and by his emotional isolation from a world that could not understand the depth of his loss or the purity of his motivations. His condition had granted him power while condemning him to solitude that made his criminal activities the only form of human contact available to him. The various attempts to cure Mr. Freeze's condition or restore his wife to life met with repeated failure, not because the science was impossible, but because the resources required exceeded what any individual could acquire through legal means, creating a vicious cycle where his criminal activities were necessary to fund research that remained perpetually just beyond his reach. Hope became its own form of torture. The relationship between Mr. Freeze and other criminals was complicated by his complete lack of interest in conventional criminal goals and his single-minded focus on his wife's preservation, making him unsuitable for most collaborative enterprises, while also ensuring that his alliance with other villains was always temporary and conditional. His dedication to Nora made him unreliable as a criminal partner but predictable as an enemy. The corporate interests that had destroyed Victor's original research continued to profit from technologies and techniques that were based upon his discoveries, creating bitter irony where his scientific achievements were being commercialized by the same entities that had prevented him from using them to save his wife. His legacy was being exploited by those who had caused his transformation. The medical community's response to Mr. Freeze's research was complicated by the criminal methods he employed to fund and conduct his experiments, making it impossible for legitimate scientists to build upon his discoveries without becoming associated with his illegal activities. His innovations in cryogenic preservation could have revolutionized medicine if they had been developed through proper channels. The philosophical questions raised by Mr. Freeze's existence encompassed fundamental issues about the relationship between love and morality, the limits of scientific ethics, and the extent to which personal devotion could justify criminal behavior, problems that had no clear answers but demanded consideration from anyone who encountered his story and his desperate quest for resurrection. The various technological innovations that Mr. Freeze developed during his criminal career included advances in cryogenic equipment, ice manipulation devices, and preservation techniques that represented genuine contributions to scientific knowledge despite being created for illegal purposes. His inventions demonstrated that criminal enterprise could produce beneficial discoveries when motivated by love rather than greed. The psychological profile that emerged from extended study of Mr. Freeze revealed a mind that retained its scientific training and ethical foundations while being driven to criminal extremes by grief and desperation that had overwhelmed his normal moral reasoning. His condition was less mental illness than rational response to impossible circumstances that had no legal solutions. The impact of Mr. Freeze's crimes on Gotham City extended beyond immediate property damage and casualties to encompass broader questions about corporate responsibility, scientific ethics, and the social obligations that accompanied advanced technological capabilities. His actions forced recognition of issues that had been ignored until they manifested in criminal form. The seasonal affective patterns that influenced Mr. Freeze's psychological state created cycles of criminal activity that corresponded to weather patterns and anniversary dates associated with his wife's condition and the Prey's laboratory accident that had transformed him. His crimes followed emotional rather than rational calendars, timing that reflected his internal state rather than strategic considerations. The cryogenic technology that Mr. Freeze employed in his criminal activities had applications far beyond his personal quest to revive his wife, encompassing potential benefits for organ preservation, space exploration, and medical treatment that could benefit countless individuals if his research could be separated from his criminal methods and developed through legitimate scientific channels. The relationship between Mr. Freeze and his memories of Nora became increasingly complex as time passed, and his recollections of their life together were preserved in the same artificial manner as her physical form, creating questions about whether his devotion was to the woman he had known or to an idealized version of her that existed only in his transformed consciousness. The winter landscapes that surrounded Mr. Freeze's hideouts and served as the settings for many of his crimes reflected both his physical requirements and his psychological state, environments where the natural world mirrored his internal coldness, while also providing him with tactical advantages over opponents who were not adapted to extreme temperatures and icy conditions. In the cryogenic chamber that served as both prison and sanctuary within the walls of Arkham Asylum, surrounded by the advanced monitoring equipment that tracked his vital signs and the specialized cooling systems that maintained his survival temperature, Victor Freeze sat in his environmental suit and contemplated the terrible mathematics of love and loss that had transformed him from healer into destroyer. The frost that formed on every surface of his cell was both evidence of his transformation and symbol of the emotional coldness that had replaced the warmth he had once shared with his wife. The photograph of Nora that he was permitted to keep showed her as she had been before her illness, smiling and vibrant and alive in ways that his memories could no longer quite capture. Yet the image also served as a reminder of everything that corporate greed and scientific limitations had stolen from both of them. He had become Mr. Freeze, not through choice, but through love that had nowhere else to go, devotion that had been frozen into criminal purpose by a world that placed profit above compassion and efficiency above humanity. The cold that sustained his transformed body was also the cold that had claimed his heart. Yet beneath the ice and isolation and criminal reputation lay the same gentle scientist who had once held his wife's hand and promised that love could conquer any obstacle, including death itself. His crimes were love letters written in ice and desperation, messages of devotion that no one could read but everyone could feel in the chill that followed his passage through their lives. In the whimsical chambers of Arkham Asylum, where childhood innocence has been perverted into instruments of terror and fairy tale wonder transformed into nightmare fuel, few patient files evoke such disturbing complexity as Patient File 0234, the meticulously documented record of Jervis Tetch, whose obsession with Lewis Carroll's literary masterpiece has consumed his brilliant mind and transformed his genuine love of literature into a twisted compulsion that preys upon the most vulnerable members of society. His evolution from respected neuroscientist to the creature known as the Mad Hatter represents one of the most chilling examples of how intellectual gifts can be corrupted by psychological inadequacy and predatory desires that masquerade as scholarly devotion. The origins of the man who would become Gotham's most disturbing purveyor of corrupted childhood wonder trace back to a youth defined by social isolation and compensatory immersion in literary worlds that provided the acceptance and adventure that reality had consistently denied him. Jervis Tetch's formative years were marked by the cruel mathematics of physical inadequacy meeting social rejection, his diminutive stature and unusual appearance creating barriers to normal peer relationships that forced him to seek companionship within the pages of books that offered friendship without judgment and adventures without the risk of humiliation. The fascination with Alice's adventures in Wonderland that would eventually consume Jervis's entire existence began as innocent childhood escape from a world that seemed designed to mock his physical limitations and social awkwardness, yet gradually evolved into something far more pathological as his identification with the story's themes of transformation, confusion, and alternative reality provided psychological refuge from disappointments that accumulated with each failed attempt at normal human connection. The academic brilliance that Jervis displayed in his studies of neuroscience and psychology was matched by an obsessive attention to detail and pattern recognition that enabled him to excel in research environments where his social inadequacies were less relevant than his intellectual capabilities. Yet his professional success could never fully compensate for the personal failures that continued to define his relationships with colleagues and potential romantic partners who found his intense personality and unusual interests deeply unsettling. The research position that provided Jervis with access to advanced neurotechnology and experimental psychiatric treatments also exposed him to the darker applications of his scientific knowledge, creating opportunities for him to explore the boundary between therapeutic intervention and behavioral manipulation that gradually eroded his ethical restraints as his personal frustrations overwhelmed his professional obligations and moral reasoning. The breakthrough in mind control technology that would eventually become the Mad Hatter's signature weapon began as legitimate research into the neurological basis of suggestion and hypnosis, techniques that could potentially revolutionize treatment of addiction, phobias, and behavioral disorders. Yet Jervis's growing obsession with power and control over others gradually transformed his scientific discoveries into instruments of psychological enslavement and sexual predation. The hat-based delivery system for his mind control devices reflected both his identification with Carroll's fictional character and his understanding of how familiar objects could conceal sophisticated technology while also serving as psychological triggers that reinforced the altered mental states that his equipment induced in victims. The choice to weaponize headwear was simultaneously practical and symbolic, combining function with his literary obsessions. The transformation from respected researcher to criminal predator was facilitated by Jervis's growing conviction that normal social rules and legal restrictions did not apply to someone of his intellectual superiority, creating a narcissistic worldview that justified any action as necessary research or appropriate reward for his exceptional capabilities. His crimes became experiments in human behavior and expressions of his frustrated desires rather than mere criminal enterprises. The Victorian gentleman persona that the Mad Hatter adopted was both protective mask and genuine reflection of his belief that he belonged to a more refined and civilized era when intellectual achievement was properly respected and social hierarchies were clearly defined, allowing superior individuals like himself to claim the recognition and privileges that modern democratic society had wrongfully denied him through its emphasis on physical attractiveness and social conformity. The Tea Party scenarios that became the Mad Hatter's trademark criminal activities were elaborate psychological rituals that combined elements of Carroll's fiction with Jervis's own twisted interpretations of social interaction and childhood innocence, creating environments where his victims were forced to participate in his fantasies while being systematically stripped of their autonomy and ability to resist his increasingly inappropriate demands. The obsession with Alice that defined many of the Mad Hatter's crimes was not limited to the fictional character but extended to real individuals, particularly young blonde women who resembled his idealized vision of Carroll's heroine, creating a pattern of stalking, kidnapping, and psychological manipulation that demonstrated both his literary fixations and his dangerous predatory instincts toward vulnerable members of society. The mind control technology that the Mad Hatter employed represented a sophisticated fusion of neuroscience, psychology, and engineering that enabled him to override victims' conscious will and implant suggestions that could persist for extended periods after the initial exposure, making his attacks particularly insidious because the damage often remained invisible until triggered by specific circumstances or commands that he had embedded in their subconscious minds. The relationship between the Mad Hatter and Batman was complicated by the hero's recognition that Jervis's crimes were motivated not by conventional criminal ambition, but by deep-seated psychological pathology and predatory sexuality that made him genuinely dangerous in ways that physical violence could not adequately address. Their confrontations required careful attention to protecting victims, while also preventing the spread of his mind control influence. The various hideouts and laboratories that the Mad Hatter established were elaborate recreations of Victorian drawing rooms and Wonderland-inspired fantasy environments that served both as functional criminal bases and as therapeutic spaces where he could live out his literary obsessions while also conducting experiments on unwilling subjects who became props in his increasingly elaborate psychological dramas. The criminal enterprises that the Mad Hatter pursued were typically motivated not by financial gain, but by his desire to acquire resources and victims for his psychological experiments and sexual fantasies, creating schemes that often appeared commercially motivated, but were actually designed to provide him with access to vulnerable individuals who could be subjected to his mind control technology and predatory behavior. The academic credentials that the Mad Hatter retained, despite his criminal transformation, enabled him to present himself as a legitimate researcher and authority figure in situations where his victims' natural defenses might otherwise protect them from his approaches, using his scientific background and scholarly demeanor to create trust that he then systematically exploited for his own gratification. The relationship between the Mad Hatter and other criminals was consistently problematic due to his condescending attitude toward colleagues whom he viewed as intellectually inferior and his tendency to attempt mind control manipulation on Blaise on Madat, potential allies who quickly learned to avoid extended contact with him. His predatory nature made him unsuitable for collaborative criminal enterprises that required trust and mutual respect. The various personas and identities that the Mad Hatter adopted throughout his criminal career were all variations on themes of intellectual superiority and Victorian gentility, whether presenting himself as a university professor, psychological consultant, or antiquarian scholar. Each role providing different opportunities to access victims, while maintaining the facade of respectability that his predatory activities required. The psychological profile that emerged from extended study of the Mad Hatter revealed a complex mixture of genuine intellectual gifts, narcissistic personality disorder, and predatory sexual compulsions that combined to create one of the most disturbing criminal minds in Arkham's population. An individual whose high intelligence made his pathology more dangerous rather than more treatable through conventional therapeutic interventions. The literary scholarship that the Mad Hatter genuinely possessed regarding Carroll's works and Victorian literature more broadly provided him with elaborate frameworks for rationalizing his criminal behavior and predatory instincts, creating intellectual justifications for actions that were motivated by base psychological needs and sexual inadequacy, rather than scholarly inquiry or artistic appreciation. The size complex that influenced many of the Mad Hatter's criminal schemes reflected his deep-seated insecurity about his physical stature and its impact on his ability to command, respect, and attract romantic partners through normal social interaction. leading to compensatory behaviors that sought to prove his superiority through intellectual domination and technological control, rather than physical presence or conventional charisma. The child psychology research that the Mad Hatter had conducted during his legitimate academic career provided him with sophisticated understanding of developmental vulnerabilities and manipulation techniques that he later applied to adult victims whose psychological defenses had been compromised by his mind control technology, creating situations where grown individuals were reduced to childlike states of dependency and suggestibility. The technological innovations that the Mad Hatter developed during his criminal career included advances in neurotransmitter manipulation, suggestion implantation, and behavioral modification that represented genuine contributions to scientific knowledge. Despite being created for predatory purposes, discoveries that could have revolutionized psychiatric treatment if they had been developed through ethical research channels. The seasonal and anniversary patterns that characterized many of the Mad Hatter's criminal activities reflected his attachment to specific dates and cultural celebrations that held significance within his literary worldview, particularly events associated with Carol's birthday, the publication dates of the Alice books, and holidays that featured elements of whimsy or childhood celebration that resonated with his twisted interpretations of innocence. The relationship between the Mad Hatter and legitimate researchers in his field was complicated by his criminal reputation and the ethical concerns surrounding his work, making it impossible for other scientists to build upon his discoveries without becoming associated with his predatory activities, effectively isolating potentially beneficial research behind barriers of moral contamination and legal liability. The various attempts to treat the Mad Hatter's psychological conditions met with limited success because his narcissistic personality disorder and predatory compulsions were reinforced by his genuine intellectual superiority and his ability to manipulate therapeutic relationships through his ability, understanding of psychological techniques, and his access to mind control technology that could potentially influence his treatment providers. The impact of the Mad Hatter's crimes on Gotham's educational and research communities was profound and lasting, creating suspicion and enhanced oversight of neuroscience research, while also making parents and institutions more cautious about individuals who displayed excessive interest in children's literature or Victorian culture, associations that unfairly stigmatized legitimate scholars and educators. The philosophical implications of the Mad Hatter's research into consciousness and free will raised fundamental questions about the nature of autonomy and the ethical boundaries that should govern scientific inquiry into human behavior, issues that his criminal applications had explored in ways that legitimate research could never attempt, while also revealing the potential for abuse that existed within any technology capable of influencing human thought. The legal complexities created by the Mad Hatter's mind control activities included unprecedented questions about criminal responsibility, consent, and the admissibility of testimony from victims whose memories and perceptions had been artificially altered, forcing the justice system to develop new frameworks for addressing crimes that operated primarily in psychological rather than physical dimensions. The media portrayal of the Mad Hatter's crimes was complicated by the whimsical elements of his persona and methods, which could easily be sensationalized or trivialized, despite the genuine harm that his predatory behavior caused to victims whose suffering was often invisible or dismissed because of the seemingly fantastical nature of his criminal activities and the cultural associations with children's literature. The rehabilitation prospects for the Mad Hatter were considered poor by most experts due to the combination of narcissistic personality disorder, sexual predation, and access to advanced mind control technology that made him both unwilling to acknowledge the harm he had caused and capable of manipulating any treatment process to his advantage, while continuing to pose risks to therapeutic staff and other patients. In the padded chambers of his Arkham cell, surrounded by the confiscated hat collection that had once concealed his most sophisticated mind control devices, Jervis Tetch sat in his institutional clothing and recited passages from memory from the Alice books that had shaped his understanding of reality and possibility. The top hat that he was no longer permitted to wear remained visible in his mind's eye, a symbol of the power and respect that his diminutive stature had never been able to command through conventional means. The mirror that reflected his unremarkable features also showed the brilliant scientist who had discovered methods for rewriting human consciousness itself, whose transformation into a predator had been driven not by evil but by loneliness, so profound that it had corrupted his understanding of connection and consent. He had become the Mad Hatter, not through madness, but through the terrible logic of inadequacy, meeting, opportunity, genius twisted into predation by a society that had valued appearance over intelligence and conformity over creativity. The Tea Party that played eternally in his memory was populated by victims who had been forced to play Alice in his twisted wonderland, yet in his distorted recollection, they appeared as willing participants in the most elaborate social gathering he had ever been able to host, guests who had finally provided him with the attention and admiration that reality had always denied his diminished physical presence and unconventional interests. In the sterile corridors of Arkham Asylum, where the thin line between healer and patient has been crossed by those whose dedication to helping others became their own path to madness. Few case files evoke such tragic irony as Patient File 0291, the comprehensive record of Dr. Harleen Frances Quinzel, whose transformation from respected psychiatrist to the creature known as Harley Quinn represents one of the most disturbing examples of how professional compassion can be weaponized against the very individuals who dedicate their lives to healing the broken minds of others. The woman who would become the clown princess of crime began her journey in the hallowed halls of Gotham University's psychology department, where her exceptional academic performance and genuine empathy for human suffering marked her as destined for greatness in the field of mental health treatment. Harleen Quinzel possessed the rare combination of analytical intelligence and emotional sensitivity that made her uniquely qualified to understand and help the most damaged individuals society had produced. Yet these same qualities would eventually make her vulnerable to manipulation by the very patient she sought most desperately to cure. The childhood that shaped Harleen's character was marked by a complex relationship with authority figures and social expectations that created within her both a deep desire to help others and a rebellious streak that questioned conventional approaches to problems that seemed to require unconventional solutions. Her early experiences with family dysfunction and emotional neglect planted seeds of empathy that would blossom into professional dedication, while also creating psychological vulnerabilities that would later be exploited by those who understood how to manipulate her need for validation and acceptance. The academic excellence that defined Harleen's university years was accompanied by social struggles that reflected her difficulty in forming meaningful relationships with peers, who found her intensity and dedication to her studies somewhat overwhelming, creating patterns of isolation and overcompensation that would later manifest in her desperate attachment to patients who seemed to appreciate her efforts in ways that normal social connections had never provided. The doctoral dissertation that established Harleen's reputation in the field of criminal psychology focused on the relationship between childhood trauma and adult psychopathy, research that demonstrated both her intellectual capabilities and her genuine desire to understand the root causes of human evil in ways that might eventually lead to more effective treatment and rehabilitation programs. Her work was groundbreaking in its empathy for subjects that other researchers viewed as irredeemably damaged. The internship at Arkham Asylum that provided Harleen with her first direct exposure to the most dangerous criminal minds in Gotham was initially viewed as a prestigious opportunity to apply her theoretical knowledge in real-world settings where her skills could make genuine differences in the fondo. Lives of patients who had been written off by other mental health professionals as hopeless cases, requiring only containment rather than treatment. The idealism that motivated Harleen's early work at Arkham was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. For while it enabled her to connect with patients in ways that other staff members could not achieve, it also made her susceptible to manipulation by individuals who understood how to exploit her need to believe in the possibility of redemption and rehabilitation, even for the most damaged personalities. The first encounter between Dr. Quinzel and the patient who would become her obsession occurred during a routine intake interview that should have been a standard psychiatric evaluation. Yet the Joker's immediate recognition of her psychological vulnerabilities and his systematic exploitation of her professional dedication created a therapeutic relationship that was corrupted from its very beginning by his deliberate manipulation of her empathetic responses. The gradual seduction that transformed Harleen from doctor to victim was not primarily sexual, but psychological, a masterful campaign of emotional manipulation that played upon her deepest insecurities and professional aspirations, while gradually eroding her ethical boundaries and clinical judgment through carefully orchestrated displays of vulnerability and apparent progress that made her believe she was achieving breakthrough success where others had failed. The sessions that documented the progression of their relationship revealed a systematic pattern of manipulation where the Joker alternated between moments of apparent sanity and profound insight that seemed to validate Harleen's therapeutic approaches with episodes of chaotic behavior that created crises requiring her personal intervention and emotional investment beyond normal professional boundaries. The ethical violations that marked the deterioration of Harleen's professional standards began as minor infractions of protocol and policy that seemed justified by the unique nature of her patient and the apparent success of her unconventional methods, yet gradually escalated into serious breaches of therapeutic boundaries that compromised both her professional integrity and her psychological well-being while making her increasingly isolated from colleagues who might have intervened. The transformation from Dr. Quinzel to Harley Quinn was not a sudden break with reality, but a gradual process of identity erosion that occurred as her professional self-image became increasingly dependent upon her relationship with the Joker and her belief that she alone possessed the insight and dedication necessary to achieve his rehabilitation and redemption. The costume that became Harley's trademark was initially conceived as a therapeutic tool designed to help the Joker feel more comfortable and communicative during their sessions, yet gradually evolved into something more personal and psychologically significant as she began to identify with the playful, chaotic persona that seemed to bring out his most human and vulnerable moments, while also providing her with an identity that felt more authentic than her professional facade. The criminal activities that marked Harley's complete transformation from healer to accomplice were initially rationalized as necessary components of the Joker's treatment, therapeutic interventions that required her participation in his fantasy world in order to maintain the rapport that made her breakthrough work possible, yet gradually became expressions of her own psychological needs, rather than professional obligations. The relationship between Harley and the Joker was characterized by patterns of emotional abuse and psychological manipulation that mirrored many of the dysfunctional family dynamics that had shaped her childhood, creating a toxic cycle where her desperate need for validation and acceptance made her increasingly willing to accept mistreatment and exploitation as evidence of love and special connection. The psychological profile that emerged from Harley's transformation revealed classic symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome and codependency that had been exacerbated by her professional training and her intellectual understanding of psychological manipulation, creating a situation where her knowledge of mental health made her more rather than less vulnerable to the very techniques she had studied academically. The various criminal schemes that Harley participated in were often motivated more by her desire to please the Joker and maintain their relationship than by any genuine commitment to criminal goals or chaotic philosophy, making her participation both more tragic and more dangerous because her actions were driven by emotional dependency rather than rational calculation of risks and benefits. The violence that Harley displayed during her criminal career was typically characterized by a childlike quality that reflected her psychological regression and her adoption of the Joker's perspective on human life and suffering, creating situations where she could commit terrible acts while maintaining a playful attitude that suggested disconnection from the reality of the harm she was causing. The relationship between Harley and other criminals was complicated by her complete devotion to the Joker and her tendency to view all other relationships as secondary to her primary attachment, making her unsuitable for collaborative enterprises that required genuine teamwork and mutual respect, rather than hierarchical submission to a dominant partner. The various attempts by Batman and other heroes to reach the Doctor, Quinzel persona that remained buried beneath Harley's criminal identity, met with limited success because her transformation had involved not just behavioral changes, but fundamental alterations in her self-concept and value system that made return to her previous identity feel like betrayal of her relationship with the Joker. The therapeutic interventions that were attempted during Harley's periods of incarceration focused on addressing the codependency and trauma bonding that had made her vulnerable to the Joker's manipulation, yet were consistently undermined by her unwillingness to acknowledge that their relationship was abusive rather than genuinely loving, and her belief that separation from him represented punishment rather than protection. The periods of separation from the Joker that occurred when they were imprisoned in different facilities or when he abandoned her during failed criminal enterprises provided glimpses of the intelligent, compassionate woman who had once dedicated her life to healing others, yet also revealed the depth of her psychological dependency and her inability to maintain a stable sense of identity without his presence and approval. The gradual development of independence that characterized Harley's later criminal career reflected both psychological growth and increasing recognition that her relationship with the Joker was fundamentally unhealthy. Yet, her movement toward autonomy was complicated by her continued attachment to the criminal identity that had emerged from their partnership and her difficulty in finding alternative sources of validation and purpose. The friendship between Harley and Poison Ivy represented one of the few genuine emotional connections that she was able to form outside of her relationship with the Joker, providing her with experiences of mutual respect and affection that contrasted sharply with the manipulation and abuse that had characterized her primary attachment, while also offering models for healthier forms of intimacy and connection. The acrobatic and combat skills that Harley developed during her criminal career reflected both natural athleticism and her psychological need to prove herself worthy of the Joker's attention and approval, transforming her from vulnerable victim into dangerous adversary, capable of holding her own in physical confrontations while also expressing her playful, performance-oriented approach to violence and conflict. The psychological insights that Harley retained from her professional training occasionally surfaced during her criminal activities, creating moments where her understanding of human nature enabled her to manipulate situations and individuals in ways that complemented her physical abilities, while also serving as reminders of the intellectual gifts that had been perverted into criminal applications. The relationship between Harley and the concept of sanity became increasingly complex as her criminal career progressed, with her behavior suggesting that her apparent madness might actually represent a form of psychological protection against the trauma of acknowledging how completely she had been manipulated and exploited by the individuals she had trusted. Most completely, the various costumes and personas that Harley adopted throughout her criminal career reflected different aspects of her psychological development and her evolving understanding of her own identity, ranging from the traditional jester outfit that symbolized her complete submission to the Joker's influence to more independent variations that expressed her growing sense of autonomy and self-determination. The impact of Harley's case on the psychiatric profession was profound and lasting, leading to enhanced training in recognizing and preventing manipulation by patients, stricter enforcement of therapeutic boundaries, and increased support systems for mental health professionals working with dangerous individuals who might attempt to exploit their caregivers' professional dedication and personal vulnerabilities. The legal implications of Harley's transformation raised complex questions about professional responsibility, criminal liability, and the extent to which victims of psychological manipulation could be held accountable for actions committed while under the influence of systematic abuse and exploitation, issues that challenge traditional frameworks for understanding criminal behavior and assigning legal responsibility. In the quiet moments between her manic episodes and criminal escapades, when the chaos subsided enough for genuine self-reflection, the woman who had become Harley Quinn sat in her Arkham cell and contemplated the long journey that had transformed her from dedicated healer into dangerous criminal, from respected professional into cautionary tale about the dangers of caring too much for those who were incapable of reciprocating healthy affection. The mirror that reflected her painted face also showed glimpses of the serious young woman who had once believed that understanding could triumph over evil, that professional compassion could reach even the most damaged individuals, that dedication and empathy were sufficient tools for healing minds that had been shattered by trauma and twisted by malevolence. She had become Harley Quinn not through choice but through manipulation, so sophisticated that even her professional training had been insufficient protection against it. The laughter that bubbled up from her throat in moments of apparent joy was tinged with hysteria that reflected her awareness of how completely she had been transformed, how thoroughly her identity had been reconstructed around the needs and desires of someone who had viewed her not as a person, but as a tool to be shaped and used for his own entertainment and validation. In the deeper recesses of Arkham Asylum, beyond the cells that house the infamous masterminds and theatrical villains who command headlines and inspire fear throughout Gotham City, there exists a collection of lesser-known, yet equally disturbing patient files that chronicle the stories of individuals whose madness takes forms both subtle and profound, whose crimes speak to different aspects of human psychological breakdown and moral collapse. These are the forgotten souls whose stories illuminate the vast spectrum of mental illness and criminal pathology that flows through the asylum's halls like a dark river of human suffering and lost potential. Patient File 0147 documents the case of Julian Gregory Day, known throughout the criminal underworld as Calendar Man, whose obsessive-compulsive relationship with dates and temporal patterns transformed him from a brilliant mathematician and chronographer into one of Gotham's most methodical and predictable killers. His crimes were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated events that corresponded to specific calendar dates, holidays, and anniversaries that held significance within his increasingly rigid and mathematically precise understanding of time's passage and meaning. The origins of Calendar Man's temporal obsession trace back to a childhood dominated by routine and ritual, where his parents' mental illness manifested through compulsive adherence to schedules and timetables that governed every aspect of family life with suffocating precision. Young Julian learned that deviation from established patterns brought chaos and punishment, while conformity to temporal structures provided safety and predictability in an otherwise unpredictable and emotionally volatile household environment. The mathematical gifts that Julian displayed from an early age were channeled into increasingly elaborate systems for organizing time and predicting patterns within calendar systems. Academic pursuits that provided him with a sense of control and mastery over forces that seemed chaotic to others, but revealed their underlying order to his analytical mind. His doctoral dissertation on temporal mathematics and chronological prediction established him as a leading expert in fields that most people never knew existed. The transformation from academic researcher to serial killer was precipitated by a series of personal losses and professional disappointments that occurred on specific dates that became burned into his memory as examples of how time itself could be weaponized against human happiness and security. His wife's death on their anniversary, his termination on his birthday, and his father's suicide on Christmas created a constellation of traumatic associations that convinced him that certain dates were inherently cursed or blessed with supernatural significance. The first murder that Julian committed as Calendar Man was timed to coincide with the anniversary of his wife's death, a crime that he rationalized as balancing the cosmic scales of justice and restoring temporal harmony to a universe that had been thrown into chaos by random tragedy and meaningless loss. The satisfaction he derived from this act of temporal terrorism convinced him that he had discovered his true calling as an agent of chronological destiny. The elaborate planning that characterized Calendar Man's subsequent crimes demonstrated his understanding that time was not merely a framework for organizing human activity, but a force that could be harnessed and directed toward specific purposes through careful calculation and precise execution. Each murder was a performance piece that celebrated or condemned the significance of particular dates, while also demonstrating his superior understanding of temporal patterns that escaped ordinary observation. The victims that Calendar Man selected were chosen not randomly, but according to criteria that reflected the thematic significance of the dates on which their deaths were scheduled to occur, creating a twisted form of performance art that merged mathematical precision with ritualistic violence in ways that satisfied both his intellectual needs and his psychological compulsions. Their deaths became components in larger equations that balanced personal trauma against cosmic justice. The costumes and personas that Calendar Man adopted for different crimes reflected the seasonal and holiday themes associated with his chosen dates, transforming him into a chameleon of temporal significance, who could embody everything from New Year's optimism to Halloween terror, depending upon the calendar coordinates that governed his current criminal enterprise. His appearance was always carefully coordinated with the symbolic meaning of his chosen timing. The relationship between Calendar Man and Batman was characterized by the killer's belief that their confrontations were part of a larger temporal pattern that gave meaning to both their existences, creating a dynamic where each encounter served as validation of his theories about destiny and predetermined significance rather than simple criminal pursuit and apprehension. Their battles were cosmic events scheduled by forces beyond human understanding. The various hideouts that Calendar Man established were elaborate shrines to temporal measurement and calendar significance, filled with clocks, calendars, and chronological instruments that enabled him to track multiple dating systems simultaneously while also serving as functional bases for planning crimes that required precise timing and extensive preparation. These spaces reflected his vision of time as the fundamental organizing principle of existence. Patient File 0356 chronicles the disturbing case of Victor Zisash, whose transformation from successful businessman to compulsive serial killer represents one of the most chilling examples of how existential despair can metastasize into systematic destruction of human life. His crimes were motivated not by anger or revenge, but by a nihilistic philosophy that viewed murder as liberation from the meaningless suffering that defined conscious existence, making him one of Arkham's most philosophically coherent yet morally horrifying inmates. The psychological profile that emerged from extensive study of Zasas revealed a mind that had retained its analytical capabilities while developing a worldview so fundamentally opposed to the value of human life that his killings became acts of mercy rather than murder in his distorted understanding of existence and consciousness. His tally marks were not trophies of victory, but accounting entries in a cosmic ledger that tracked his contributions to ending human suffering through systematic elimination. The business empire that Zaz had built during his pre-criminal career was destroyed through a combination of poor decisions and malicious interference that left him financially ruined and psychologically shattered, creating within him a profound disillusionment with the concept of human achievement and the meaningfulness of individual effort in a universe that seemed designed to frustrate ambition and crush hope through random catastrophe, systematic injustice. The gambling addiction that contributed to Zaz's financial collapse also provided him with his first taste of the existential freedom that came from accepting the random nature of outcomes and the futility of human planning and effort, experiences that gradually convinced him that life itself was nothing more than a cosmic gambling game where the house always won, and the only rational response was to quit playing before losing everything that mattered. The first murder that Zsas committed was presented to his victim as an act of mercy, a liberation from the suffering and disappointment that defined human existence. Yet the satisfaction he derived from this killing was not sadistic but philosophical. The peace that came from successfully demonstrating his theories about the meaninglessness of individual existence and the mercy inherent in permanent escape from consciousness. Patient File 0289 documents the case of Garfield Linz, whose transformation from special effects artist to the pyromaniacal villain known as Firefly represents the corruption of creative passion into destructive obsession, when professional disappointment meets psychological instability and access to dangerous materials. His crimes were elaborate demonstrations of his pyrotechnic expertise that served both as revenge against an industry that had rejected his talents and as artistic expressions that could only be fully appreciated through destruction. The childhood trauma that shaped Linz's relationship with fire involved a house fire that killed his family while leaving him with severe burns, and a complex psychological relationship with flame that combined terror with fascination, creating within him an understanding of fire as both destroyer and creator, enemy and ally, force of chaos, and instrument of purification. His scars were physical reminders of lessons that most people never learned firsthand. The special effects career that provided Linz with legitimate outlets for his pyrotechnic interests was destroyed by industry politics and technological changes that made his practical fire effects obsolete in favor of computer-generated imagery that lacked the authenticity and danger that made his work artistically satisfying. His replacement by digital technology felt like personal rejection of everything he had dedicated his life to mastering. The costume that became Firefly's trademark was both protective equipment that enabled him to survive his own pyrotechnic displays, and a technological marvel that incorporated advanced flight systems with sophisticated incendiary weapons, transforming him from earthbound artist into aerial demon whose performances could be witnessed throughout Gotham City as monuments of flame and destruction that demanded recognition of his creative vision. Patient File 0417 chronicles the complex case of Arnold Wesker and his ventriloquist dummy Mr. Scarface, whose psychological condition represents one of the most unusual examples of dissociative identity disorder in Arkham's files, where a meek and gentle personality has been dominated by an aggressive alter ego that manifests through interaction with an inanimate object that serves as both psychological crutch and criminal mastermind. The childhood abuse that created Wesker's dissociative condition involved systematic humiliation and violence that taught him that assertive behavior brought punishment, while passive compliance provided safety, creating psychological patterns that made it impossible for him to express anger or aggression directly without experiencing overwhelming anxiety and guilt. His personality split represented an attempt to preserve his gentle nature while also providing outlets for the rage that accumulated from years of mistreatment. The dummy that became the focus of Wesker's alternate personality was discovered in an antique shop where its gangster appearance and aggressive expression seemed to call out to psychological needs that his conscious mind could not acknowledge or satisfy through direct action. The relationship between man and puppet became a complex dance of psychological projection and criminal activity that satisfied needs that neither could address independently. The crimes that were committed by this unusual partnership were characterized by their old-fashioned gangster style and methods that reflected both the dummy's 1920s appearance and Wesker's unconscious admiration for criminal figures who possessed the courage and aggression that he lacked in his conscious personality. Their criminal activities were expressions of psychological needs rather than rational criminal enterprises. Patient File 055-2 documents the tragic case of Waylon Jones, whose genetic condition transformed him from a normal human being into the creature known as Killer Croc, yet whose real tragedy lies not in his physical mutation, but in society's response to his appearance and the psychological damage inflicted by years of rejection, exploitation, and dehumanization that gradually convinced him to embrace the monstrous identity that others had imposed upon him. The rare genetic disorder that caused Jones's transformation was not merely a medical condition, but a social catastrophe that destroyed every normal relationship and opportunity in his life, while marking him as fundamentally different from other human beings in ways that made integration into normal society impossible, despite his retention of human intelligence and emotional needs. His appearance became his destiny in ways that no medical intervention could address. The carnival and freak show circuit that provided Jones with his only opportunities for employment also reinforced his isolation from normal human society, while teaching him that his value lay entirely in his ability to frighten and disgust audiences who paid to see him as a curiosity rather than recognizing his humanity. These experiences taught him that Monster was not just appearance but role that society expected him to play. The underground communities where Jones found acceptance among other outcasts and criminals provided him with the first genuine human connections he had experienced since childhood. Yet these relationships were based upon mutual desperation and criminal enterprise, rather than healthy emotional bonds, creating social connections that satisfied his need for belonging, while also drawing him deeper into patterns of violence and antisocial behavior. The physical strength that resulted from Jones's condition made him valuable to criminal organizations that needed muscle for their operations, while also making him dangerous to anyone who threatened or betrayed him, creating a reputation for violence that was based as much on his appearance and the fear it inspired as on his actual actions. His strength became both asset and curse that defined his criminal career. The regression toward more primitive behavior patterns that characterized Jones's later criminal activities reflected both his psychological response to constant dehumanization and his growing identification with the reptilian aspects of his appearance that others emphasized while ignoring his human characteristics and needs. His embrace of crocodilian behavior was defensive mechanism rather than genuine psychological transformation. These forgotten souls of Arkham represent the vast spectrum of human psychological breakdown and the myriad ways that trauma, disappointment, and social rejection can transform ordinary individuals into criminal figures whose actions reflect not evil but damage, not malice but desperation, not choice but the terrible logic of circumstances that overwhelm human resilience and moral reasoning. Their stories serve as reminders that madness comes in many forms, that criminal behavior emerges from complex interactions between individual psychology and social environment, and that understanding requires looking beyond surface symptoms to recognize the human beings who remain trapped within the monsters and that circumstance and trauma have created from the raw material of damaged, but still essentially human, consciousness. In the collective silence of their cells, these lesser-known inmates of Arkham represent the broader truth that every criminal file tells a story of potential unrealized, of paths not taken, of choices made under pressures that most people never face and could not survive without similar psychological damage and moral compromise. As our journey through these troubled minds draws to its close, remember that within these walls of Arkham Asylum lies not merely a collection of criminals, but a catalogue of human potential corrupted, brilliance misdirected, and souls lost to the darkness that dwells within us all. Each patient file tells the story of choices made and paths taken, of trauma unhealed and wounds that festered until they consumed the very essence of who these individuals might have been. In their madness, we find reflections of our own capacity for both creation and destruction, the thin line that separates hero from villain, sanity from chaos. Let these tales remind you that redemption is always possible, that understanding can triumph over fear, and that even in the deepest darkness, the light of hope can still shine. Rest now, guardian of the night, knowing that tomorrow brings new opportunities for healing, for growth, and for the eternal human struggle to choose compassion over cruelty, love over hate, and hope over despair.